All right, good morning. Good morning. I just want to welcome everyone to Georgetown. I'm Josh Teitelbaum. I think I actually know everyone in this room now, so you know that. So in addition to being a law and economics faculty member here, at the moment I'm an associate dean, and so I am officially welcoming you on behalf of Dean Traynor and Georgetown Law School to Georgetown and to the Warren F. Schwartz Memorial Conference. I just want to thank a number of people, and I want to start with Warren's family. The turnout of his family today is incredible, so thank you, Deborah Chasman, for being here. Edward and Meredith Schwartz, Lisa and Lance Pomerantz and their children, Jeremy and Lionel, and also Claire Karsting, and to Warren's daughter, Madeline, her husband, Evan Pomerantz. Thank you so much for coming. It really makes this event very meaningful for all of us, and it's just wonderful that you're here. I also want to thank Ian Main and our special events office for all of the logistics that go on behind the scenes for this, so thank you very much. Including dinner last night. And I want to thank my co-organizers, Lee, Abe, and Steve Salop. Thank you so much for all of this today. Wouldn't be possible. So I will say two things and then invite Alan Schwartz, Kathy Zeiler, and Steve Salop to come and give their remembrances of Warren. But let me give my very brief one. And I also just want to invite everyone, when it's your turn to present today, feel free to take a moment and say whatever you would like about Warren. So I didn't know him very well, right? I arrived to Georgetown in 2009. He had retired in 2004, but he was still here, emeritus faculty member. And even though I didn't know him very well, I owe him an immense debt of gratitude. He was a member of the founding generation of law and economics scholars, and he paved the way for me here at Georgetown and in the Legal Academy. It was an honor to have him attend the law and economics workshops, which I started running when I arrived with Kathy Zeiler, that he had started and pioneered here. And it was an honor to have him attend those workshops. He was a persistent and insightful questioner and added value to every discussion. And I'm sorry that I didn't know him better, but I'm delighted to be here today. So now, let me invite Alan and then Kathy and Steve. Thank you.
So Warren was an academic friend of mine. That is, I would see him at conferences or at workshops, and I had the feeling, and I think he might have too, that if we were ever in the same city, we would be friends. But we never got to be in the same city, so we were academic friends, and so mainly I know Warren in role. Warren was, as you know, acerbic, critical, passionate, and also lovable, which I think is a Jewish trait. I'm trying as hard as I can to get there, but I may have a couple of the first three, but it's the last one that I'm still having a problem with. I want to say a couple of things about Warren and about his career. One is to say that in academic life there are, at various places, centers of excellence, and then they sometimes dissolve because the university didn't support them, or they were better than the university, or people had personal things that caused them to leave. But when I first got into law and economics, a center of excellence was Virginia Law School. It had great people then. Now, some of the family might not know these names, but all your academics would know. It had Jerry Mashaw, Michael Gratz, Charlie Getz, Bob Scott, Dick Spidell, Jeffrey O'Connell, and it was. I remember when I first met Michael Gratz and he started talking about things, and I said the same thing that you get in one of these movies. I think it was like, who are these guys? You know, I mean, and Warren was at the heart of that group. He recruited some of them. He supported all of them. He was a center of excitement, and the tradition that he started at Virginia, well, Josh said he paved the way here, but the tradition Warren started at the University of Virginia has lasted. It has been, since he was there, one of the best places in the country to do law and economics, and that tradition has really continued. And very few people you can say that about. Now, in terms of knowing Warren in role, I'm just going to tell this little story and stop. But in terms of knowing Warren in role, he was always in role, and he was passionate about law and economics and about intellectual clarity and about ideas. And there was no deflecting him. So, as you know, some time ago, I was asked to give an address at the European Law and Economics Association, which was a smaller group then than it was now, but it was a trip and it was Rome. So, of course, there we were in Rome, and I gave this address, and my theme was that law and economics should pay more attention to implementability. That is, we had a lot of solutions, but getting them through institutions was not as much attention was paid to that as ought to be. Was my talk, and as soon as I finished, Warren raised his hand. I said, "What is it?" He said, "Alan," he said, "that was the worst talk I ever heard in my life." So this is where Warren would begin, So knowing Warren, I said, well, Warren, did you like the talk? And Warren said, "No, I hated the talk." And it turned out that he was actually right, because what I was doing rational actor theory about the private actors, say, in a tort context. But I wasn't doing rational actor theory about the administrators who were supposed to implement things. And so I had this sort of nirvana fallacy that the right set of administrators, well-motivated, would be able to solve problems, and we just had to talk to them in the right way. And Warren's view was, as he finally put it, "Alan, you're an idiot." But it was that consistency of Warren's intellectual approach through everything that I think distinguished him as a scholar and as a person. And this idea that you pay attention to institutions, I think, has produced, could we say, a monster? I wouldn't refer to Ed as a monster, but Ed has spent his life thinking about institutions, and you kind of understand why. So for me, losing Warren was... it was a real personal loss. I just look forward to going to meetings and seeing him and talking to him and having him say to other people, "That was the worst talk I ever heard." And it said, thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. So I want to first just say how delighted I am to be a part of this day. Thank you so much to Lee and Josh and Steve and Abe for organizing this. It's just a great way to honor Warren's memory. I got to know Warren very well. I came to Georgetown in 2003. Warren was still very active. In fact, as Josh mentioned, after he went emeritus, he was still around. And even when he couldn't drive anymore, he was just taking cabs in from Virginia. He would not relent, which was great for us. It was great to have him around. He was a great mentor for me. When I first arrived here, I had never taught before, and so I decided I wanted to teach a seminar for the students on behavioral law and economics. And Warren got wind of this, and he decided he was going to sit in on the entire semester.
For you.
Oh, yeah. So if any of you know about Warren's feelings about behavioral economics, you would understand, how terrified I was. I had my misgivings about behavioral economics. I was sort of a skeptic of the field, and at that time. But I thought this would be a great opportunity for me to read things and learn more about it, and see more about the intersection between behavioral economics and law. But I was highly skeptical. But during the seminar, I found myself being forced to be the best advocate I could be for behavioral economics for the students, because Warren was on the other side every day. Warren was just hammering away at everything that we were reading. There was nothing that he liked. There was no convincing him that this was useful in any way. And so the students were doing. So I organized the class to let the students really lead the class. And so the students would come in, they would read the readings, and they would design experiments that they would run during class. It was quite impressive what they were doing. And then they would just get beaten down. Warren would just hammer away every day. But I think that it was a great opportunity for the students and also for me to see Warren operating in the classroom and really forcing us to get very, very precise and really think about what was going on in this literature. And I'll never forget that I was was probably the class I prepared for the most in any of my entire, 13-year teaching career. So I have very fond memories of Warren. Another thing that I think I will never forget about Warren is just his participation in faculty meetings. So Georgetown is a I'm sure you heard all about them, Debbie. Georgetown was a huge faculty, and so maybe, I don't know, we'd have 60 or 70 people at meetings. And no matter what we were talking about, Warren would have something to say about it, and it was often critical, and people would just sort of brace themselves. And so he got to become his reputation was one of a curmudgeon. People just thought, Warren's going to hate everything, but I viewed it as someone who just was inspired to make the place better. He was always thinking about how can we improve, how can we get better, how can we excel. And so I really appreciated his pushing. We would talk about opening new programs, and he would say things like, has anyone, thought about the costs and the, how much expected revenue we might bring in from this? And people would look at him like he was some kind of alien. Like, what do you? Is that something we have to think about? And it was so he really brought a sense of rigor, not only to scholarship and teaching, but also just the governance of the law school. So he was consistent across his different roles in the academy. I miss Warren a lot. I think about him often. I have benefited greatly from his mentorship, and I hope that I can do similar things for my colleagues and my students and my everyone around me, really, my family, that Warren has done here. Thank you so much.
Hi, I knew Warren since I came here in 1981. And Warren guided my tenure case before the faculty the next year. So I'll come back to it in a minute. But Kathy's, I think Alan's first paragraph really said it all about Alan. And Kathy's remark about the faculty meeting reminded me of something that my first year here, we had a faculty meeting, and Jack Kramer was the assistant dean. It was to establish a loan forgiveness program for people that went into public interest law. I mean, I think we were probably the first one ever. And Jack's arguments for this program were that, number one, it would encourage a lot of people to go into public interest law. And number two, it wouldn't be very expensive because nobody goes into public interest law. And you all laugh, but it was a fairly early faculty meeting for me, and I stood up, raised my hand, and said, well, you really can't have it both ways, or whatever. And nobody noticed. I mean, I sat down, and it's not like, faculty meetings, everyone says, I want to associate myself with the last N people that spoke. Nobody had anything to say about the remark I made, which I think Jack Kramer said, well, no. I think that was, And, after the faculty meeting, of course, Warren said, that was fabulous. I really agreed with you. And but it was really hard doing law and economics, for Warren back in those days with the dedication to rigor that he had. When I came, I taught a faculty workshop But I had no horse in the race. I was just there telling them about economics. I had no need for law to change the way that Warren did. So he actually found the seminar really frustrating because he was hoping that after each seminar, everyone would stand up and say, okay, we've got it, we're going to do law and economics from here on in and everything. And that really gets me to what I wanted to say, which is that Warren was a scholar, but he was more than a law and economics scholar. He was a born-again economist, and there aren't many of them, but he certainly was. I mean, for those of you that don't know, Warren spent a semester at University of Chicago. You would have thought he spent 10 years there. He was actually only there one semester. But he went and he got hooked on the cult and never turned back, and was just dedicated to the proposition that economic analysis made a difference to law. I think he was dedicated to the analytics, but I think he was also really dedicated to the rigor. He really loved the rigor. Warren's, probably his greatest regret is that he did not have a PhD, or couldn't do the math. Although he had no desire to learn how to do the math, but that he wasn't better with the technical tools, because he just really loved the rigor. But while he wasn't trained, I mean, he was remarkably good at applying economic reasoning and complex economic reasoning to legal problems. I mean, and we all know that he was intellectually creative. And probably most important, he was incredibly strong-willed and opinionated about the right way to do it. And he did that in a way, he refused to accept complacency, as you all, again, I don't know why I'm telling this to all of you. I mean, you all know this as well as I do. And, it's that seriousness of purpose and the tenaciousness that I think, not tenaciousness for its own sake, though that's probably true as well, but the intellectual tenaciousness for higher insight and greater understanding. I mean, what was both fabulous and frustrating about Warren is that every conclusion demanded greater complexity. He was unwilling to simply accept that, wow, that's a great idea, that's a great result. Anytime you would tell Warren what you accomplished, he would say, okay, well, you've left out A, B, C, and D. These are really interesting questions that you should really analyze. And there was no, I learned in graduate school, and sort of part of what I do is I think you should always stop and adore your results, right? I mean, when you get that theorem on the board or whatever, you just stop and adore it for a while and cherish it and see. Warren zoomed right past the cherishing stage. He, as you all know, because you worked with him or were his students, that if he were here today, on each of these talks today, he would tell you what you left out, what issue you skimmed over that you shouldn't have. And I'm sure you remember Warren in that way every time you write a paper. I certainly do. But at the same time, Warren, yes, curmudgeon, but really joyful and irreverent. And I think a lot of people didn't understand that about him. And again, it's his Brooklyn roots. I mean, it's that combination of factors must all be the Brooklyn roots. I took these remarks from what I said at Warren's funeral, and I said at his funeral that Warren influenced generations of students and colleagues. But again, you all know all that because you are those people, and that's why you're here today. So, what I'm hoping we do as we go through the day is that whenever anybody gives a talk, we should say to each other all the things that Warren said to us about our work. And it will both make the papers better, and it's how we remember them. So that's my charge for the day. Thank you.
So, Alan, notwithstanding Steve's suggestion, I think I'm going to resist the temptation to tell everybody that that was the worst talk I ever heard. So we can skip that one, especially after this one. Good morning, everybody. First, I would like, on behalf of our family, to thank very much the Georgetown University Law Center for supporting and hosting this event in honor of Warren. I just remember how incredibly touched and pleased I was when I learned that this was going to happen. This was his home in a lot of ways for a long time. I obviously, we want to thank Josh and Ian as well for all of their help putting it together on the ground here, and Lee and Abe and Steve for putting together the program and getting this amazing collection of people who were so important to Dad in one way or another together for this. He would have loved this, right? And he would have sat there and he would have been the first one to raise his hand after every single presentation. Okay, so I realize that this is first and foremost an academic conference. We'll get to the paper, but I do want to start with one anecdote, but it is related to the paper. And some of you have heard this before, but it's probably been a long time. But I want to talk a little bit about how it is that Warren and I ended up in the jury business to begin with. And as you might imagine, this is a pretty profound moment in my life because now I am a professional jury consultant. And I can say without any question at all that but for the story I'm about to tell, I wouldn't be doing the job right now that I do. So at some point in the early 1990s it was, Warren was teaching the Law and Economics workshop here, and I think he was using Lynn Stout's case book at the time. And one of the very last chapters had to do with a pair of companion cases from 1972, Apodaca v. Oregon and Johnson v. Louisiana. And these actually came up pretty recently. The Supreme Court revisited these. And they had to do with the constitutionality of the schemes present in both Oregon and Louisiana, which permitted juries in criminal cases in those states to make decisions under something other than a unanimity rule. Okay? So the court really didn't know what to do with these cases. The opinions are basically competing conjectures about human nature. The majority position says, look, notwithstanding the fact that they don't have to get everybody's vote, there's no evidence to suggest that people who are winning, if you will, on the jury will just stop deliberating and not listen to people who disagree with them. And then the minority position on the court was somewhat more pessimistic and said, well, there's no evidence to suggest that these people, once they have enough votes, will listen to people who disagree with them. Okay? And as it turned out, of course, both sides were right because there was no evidence at all on the subject. So each justice was free to insert his or her own conjecture about human behavior. So after they had discussed these cases, one of the students raised his hand and said, well, Professor Schwartz, what's the right answer? At which point my father, apparently without skipping a beat, said, well, I don't rightly know, but I've invested a lot of money in the human capital of somebody who might be able to help us find out. So the next day, I'm in my office at the Stanford Business School during graduate school, and the phone rings, and a voice familiar to us all was on the other end and said, told me the story and said, is this an interesting question? And whatever else you can say about Dad, he was all about interesting questions, right? And so I thought about it, and I thought, this is a social choice problem, and that's what I do. And so, yes, this is an interesting question. So suddenly, Warren and I found ourselves jury scholars. And we were on our way. So as I was doing some research, I thought, well, somebody has to have studied this before. And it turned out there really wasn't very much on the topic. there were some probabilistic models out there, a la sort of Condorcet jury theorem kind of stuff. Most notably, a piece that Al Klavoric had written a few years before. But they were, like I said, sort of probabilistic, the presumption that they all started with, that there was a binary choice being made and that there was actually a right answer to each of these cases. And so this was essentially an information aggregation exercise to see whether or not the jury would get the verdict correct as a function of, among other things, what voting rule was being used. Okay? Information processing, objective evaluation, right? But that's not the way that we approach this problem. After all, I'm a political scientist. I mean, economics by training, political science by subject matter. We wanted to think more seriously about the jury as a democratic institution, right? It is one of the only participatory democratic institutions we have in this country. And, we realized that it might be nice and useful to abstract and think about the jury making these objective decisions, but that's not really what's going on, because after all, jurors are not asked, did the defendant do it, right? Jurors are asked, given the totality of the evidence, has the state proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt? And there is an enormous amount of ambiguity and discretion involved in trying to answer that question, okay? And so even if you have general agreement about who did what to whom, when, and whatnot, there's a lot of subjective evaluation there. Jurors need to think about how believable witnesses are. They need to think about how much weight to give to competing evidence. They need to think about what exactly is meant by the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. You throw in there ambiguity of language, things like mens rea, right? So there are a lot of questions that jurors ask to answer which do not have right answers and about which reasonable people can disagree. And so from that perspective, the reason that we put a bunch of people in a room to answer these questions, right, is because we appreciate the fact that there will be reasonable disagreement and we need to resolve that, okay? And then, of course, there's the whole jury nullification element of it, which throws another wrench in the works. Okay? So rather than thinking of this as an information aggregation enterprise, we were thinking of it as a preference aggregation enterprise. And so that's the way that we approached our sort of mechanism design question, if you will. Okay, so the idea is if you were going to build a system whereby ordinary citizens were brought together in groups to vote on outcomes, and you wanted that system to embody basic shared democratic values that we see embodied in other democratic institutions in our country, what the heck would it look like, and would it look like anything we've got now? And that was kind of where we started. We wrote 4 articles on the topic, ending with one in 2000 that came out in the USC Interdisciplinary Law Review, where we kind of tied it all up in a bow, if you will. Now, at about the same time that we were starting this enterprise, Jeff Abramson came out with an excellent and very influential book called We the Jury. Okay. Now, Jeff is a professor at Brandeis. He's a political philosopher, former prosecutor, and a friend of mine. And since I was at Harvard at the time, I spent a lot of time buying Jeff lunches and talking to him about this stuff. And so Jeff also was thinking about the jury from a democratic perspective, and he had basic conclusions that he came to in this very good book about how the jury should operate from a democratic theory perspective. So the first is recognizing that there's important discretion to be exercised, important questions about which our society is not in agreement necessarily, that we need to embrace the diversity in our population, and we want juries, to the extent possible, to be representative of the communities from which they are drawn, essentially the cross-sectional ideal. Deliberations are enhanced by that, by having all voices heard. Therefore, peremptory challenges are fundamentally undemocratic because they silence certain voices and opinions and experiences by simply having them absent all the time. People with extreme views in one direction or another. His aspirations were that by having all the voices in the community present, that deliberations would then lead the jury naturally to conclusions that were based on common values, right? And he thought unanimity was important to this process by forcing people to find arguments and ways of thinking about the problems the jury confronted that cut across group boundaries. Okay? He did not want people, he expected people to enter the jury room, right, with all these different experiences and perspectives and viewing the evidence through the lens of those experiences, but he didn't want people to see themselves as representatives of particular groups. So his thought was that the deliberations should allow the jury, ideally, to find common ground and common ideals and values from which they would reach a verdict. It all sounded great to us, and I mean that completely seriously. You know, our view was, yeah, this is the right way to think about the jury. There was just one problem, a question that we asked Jeff time and time again. But Jeff, what happens if it doesn't work? What happens if, notwithstanding the open-minded, free-form, complete deliberation that you talk about, right? If people enter the jury room with valid differences of opinion, what's to say that even after they talk it through as best they can, right? Well, they might still disagree, and that's okay, but you still got to figure out what the hell to do with the defendant. And Abramson's book is essentially silent on that. So, that was unacceptable to us for a variety of reasons. And so we then, in doing our own work, we came to some conclusions about how the system should operate, taking into account the possibility that even after all of the good-natured and well-meaning deliberation that we're talking about, right, jurors might still disagree, okay? So, again, we adopt a lot of the same basic tenets that Abramson does, but we, cross-sectional ideal is very important to us. We believe, and this comes from democratic theory and social choice theory, all votes should count equally. So you shouldn't set up a system that artificially counts some people's votes more than others, either because of who they are or what they believe. It should be a system that encourages jurors to vote sincerely, both because people should vote sincerely, but also because you want the verdict that ultimately comes out the other end to be a genuine reflection of the perceptions and conclusions of the jury that made that decision. And that ultimately whatever system you want to implement needs to be able to resolve all the cases, which means you have to be able to tell the system what happens, what should happen if disagreement persists through deliberations. And so we came to the conclusion that the way to handle this, and the best way to handle it, is simple majority rule for all criminal jury trials. Now, as you might imagine, this was met with a certain amount of fear, trepidation, and skepticism out there, right? By people like Jim, and plenty of other folks as well. And so there were concerns about what this meant for deliberations. There was concerns about what this meant for defendants and conviction rates and things along those lines. We address all those things in the articles. I encourage you to go back and read them. Dust off those volumes that haven't come out of the library in a long time or whatever. But one of the objections that we received from people who just sort of had a bad, negative, visceral reaction to all of this, including Jeff Abramson, was that we had basically crafted a solution to a problem that did not exist. Okay? That this persistent disagreement, what I refer to now in this current article as a consensus failure, is not really a problem. Okay? And that, the system isn't broke, we don't need to fix it. Okay? And the general rationale that's given for dismissing the conclusions, the analysis we did and the conclusions we draw, was the fact that, frankly, hung jury rates are very low, which is the one metric that's out there that everybody looks at as an indication of the fact that consensus was not reached on the jury. Now, I'll tell you that hung jury rates really vary quite a lot from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, depending on whether you're talking about misdemeanors and felonies, et cetera, but the national hung jury rate is actually fairly low, and it actually doesn't appear to be rising precipitously, notwithstanding the current culture we're living in, although I haven't seen any measures in the last couple of years, right? But the point that we make in our article, among others, is the fact that a consensus failure, and I don't want to use the word failure in a negative way with respect to the jurors, right? Jurors who deliberate honestly, openly, and yet still disagree have not failed in their duties. It's just the fact that they haven't actually reached consensus. But consensus failure can have a variety of outcomes, one of which is that if everybody actually votes their conscience and votes honestly, you get a hung jury. Okay, fine. But other things can happen too. Notwithstanding the fact that the jurors don't agree, they can still all vote the same way, and you can get a verdict anyway. That is, you can have insincere voting. And I think we all understand how that can happen and why it might happen. You get war of attrition, you get bullying on the jury, you get people who frankly just want to go home, they need to get back to work or what have you. Okay? And so you get jurors who essentially violate their oaths as jurors, they violate their conscience, and they lie to all of us, and they probably don't think of it that way, because they think the verdict ought to be one thing, but they vote for something else. Okay, and this is a bad thing. I don't think anybody who would defend the unanimity system argues that this is a good byproduct of that system, right? But it remains an open empirical question how often this happens, right? We suggest it probably happens a lot, and there's evidence from experimental research that it happens pretty often. We certainly have plenty of anecdotes out there where jurors come forward after cases and express regret, or they tell stories about having been bullied in the jury room. We now have some cases coming out where there's racial animus in the jury room, and the question is, is this of constitutional import such that Rule 606B now needs to have a constitutional exception for this kind of behavior, right? So we know anecdotally it happens, we know experimentally it happens, but empirically is this serious, right? And we didn't have an answer for that until now. And so that's what I want to talk to you about. So this was not a big problem, but the question is this a big problem? So in 2009, Nicole Waters and Valerie Hans published what I consider the most important article about the American jury that nobody's ever read, okay? So they did a study as part of a big project that was funded by the National Center for State Courts into hung juries generally. Okay? And what they did was they conducted a very extensive survey of lawyers, judges, and jurors in felony cases in 4 major metropolitan jurisdictions. And what they did was they surveyed people after they came out of jury duty at the end of hearing the case and rendering a verdict. And one of the things that they did, among with lots of other questions, was they asked each juror individually, if it were entirely up to you as a one-person jury, what would your verdict have been in this case? So this now provides us an opportunity to find out, ex post, how many people thought one thing but voted for something else. Okay. So we had, in the sample that we could use, 368 felony trials, over 3,000 jurors, 4 large metropolitan areas where you would imagine there's quite a lot of diversity, which is a good test for an Abramsonian model of deliberations. We had a distribution of outcomes here. We had 63% convictions, we had 28% acquittals, and we had 9% hung juries. These numbers may seem a little odd compared to what you're used to seeing out there. Remember, they're felonies only, and they're in large urban jurisdictions, so you might imagine that would drive the conviction rates down and the hung jury rates up a little bit, and the acquittal rates up a little bit. Anybody who's been a prosecutor in a big city, right, it's a struggle sometimes. Okay, so then the question becomes, how many of these verdicts were actually unanimous? Okay, we had 233 convictions, only 2/3 of them were actually unanimous. Right? And then we had a variety number of what we call conforming dissenters, people who, notwithstanding the fact that they didn't agree with the verdict, voted for it anyway. And realize that these are very conservative estimates of the incidence of this kind of behavior because it was self-reporting right? So these people had to both overcome their cognitive dissonance from having thought one thing and done something else, but also been willing to admit to the researchers that they behaved in this way. Now, I think the surveys were anonymous, but still, you might imagine people would be reluctant to admit to this kind of behavior. Okay? So a third of these people were convicted, notwithstanding the fact that the jury did not actually unanimously believe they were guilty. Okay? The story for acquittals is really very remarkable. It turns out that only 12% of those acquittals were actually unanimous. The vast majority of them had at least one conforming dissenter. This is maybe not quite so surprising given the asymmetric burden of proof. You would imagine people would be more willing to vote for an acquittal they didn't believe in than a conviction they didn't believe in. But realize the unanimity rule does not help defendants, right? It's the unanimity rule together with insincere voting that helps defendants. Okay? So what would have happened if all of these people had actually voted sincerely? What does the reality of jury behavior look like? How much unanimous consensus is there really? Well, it turns out we would have had 41% convictions. We would have had 3% acquittals, and we would have had 56% hung juries. 56%. And this is a conservative estimate, given that it's all about self-reporting. Okay, so what do we learn? Unanimous verdicts do not mean that you actually have unanimous consensus. Consensus failure, as we define it, is normal, it's persistent, it's problematic, and of course we hide it, which is not cool. And that the unanimity requirement then creates a certain arbitrariness in verdicts because, of course, you end up with all these verdicts produced not because the jury was unanimous, but because that jury happened to contain people who were willing to roll over for one reason or another, which is not a good way to distinguish those people who should be convicted from those people who shouldn't. Okay? It is obviously inefficient to the extent that it doesn't reflect people's real values and that it requires retrials in some circumstances, and it is undemocratic for these various reasons. Okay? So, to those people who wanted to dismiss the analysis that we did all those years ago, 25 years ago, we started this, what I get out of these numbers is the fact that we loop back to the underlying question. And yes, War, it was a really good question, which is what do we do when jurors disagree? And so I suggest it's a new day, and the question is still there, and the question is still important. All right, thank you very much. You want me to stay up? Where do you want me, Jim? Where am I supposed to go? I'll hang out up here.
So, as everyone has stated, it's such a pleasure to be part of this gathering of friends and family of Warren Schwartz. We all have our favorite memories of him. For my own part, he was a wonderful friend, collaborator on some things. My favorite memory, as I've told some of you before, was when I tried my very best in the library at the British Library in London to get Warren to learn how to run a microfiche machine with no success whatever. But here's an image that sticks in my mind that I did want to mention. Once when I was in London, I saw a poster at an art shop. And I bought it and brought it home, and I think it was framed and in their home at one point. But it was a poster that to me was just the epitome of Warren. It was a poster, a picture of a small French boy wearing shorts, exuberantly walking through the street, holding a large magnum of red wine. And to me, that was Warren. It was just a perfect image. At Warren's 70th birthday gathering, I read a few lines of doggerel that I will impose upon you now, and in some of a repeat. Warren still gets his kicks out of Caldor Hicks, sees nothing morose in the theorem cos, finds refreshingly breezy all of Guido Calabrese, delights to teach about efficient breach, thinks those who cling to jury unanimity demonstrate palpable pusillanimity. Well, that's enough, but today we revisit the question of jury unanimity. Warren and Edward have studied this, as he's explained, analyzing the unanimous jury feature as well as other aspects of jury trial. Edward's paper today explores and explodes the unanimity question with the advantage of this large empirical study that he has described by Waters and Hahn. Now, others can assess that empirical data better than I. My comments instead will, unsurprisingly, be related to legal history. I'm an outlier at this group. I don't do law and economics, but I do study English history, particularly 18th century English. And I want to draw a bit from the UK heritage. But first, let me state a few quibbles with Edward's paper. Edward says, and I'm quoting here, "The production of unanimous verdicts through insincere voting of jurors is undesirable because it transforms unanimity into a legal fiction." Well, there are two fundamentals about the Anglo-American tradition of trial by jury that are larger legal fictions. The first is the expression, a jury of peers. That expression you all know. It's a supposedly classic attribute of the process that is said to ensure fairness for defendants. But the expression is, and for centuries has been, a legal fiction. Historically, that is most easily demonstrated by the exclusion from the jury pool of women, minorities, people who have no wealth. This, and possibly, if we go back far enough, we can find a jury that might be one of peers. But the second legal fiction relates to the reasonable cross-section requirement, which Edward has spoken about and Abramson emphasizes so much in his We the Jury book. This requirement, calling for diversity in jury selection, obviously pulls in the opposite direction from the notion of a jury of peers. At times, and perhaps by inference in Edward's paper, there's a suggestion that the reasonable cross-section principle produces reasonable cross-sections on individual juries. But this is another legal fiction, and that would be a complete fluke if that were to happen. The only reasonable cross-section required is that the often quite large jury pool from which jurors are drawn must reflect a reasonable cross-section of the population of the community where the trial is taking place. Now, let me turn to the compared to what question. If not unanimity, then is majority vote the proper formula? Many of us on the faculty recall Warren and Edward talking about this, and many of us said, well, at least let's have a supermajority. And I think Edward does not necessarily disagree with that, even though he prefers the majority model. But here I want to bring out a bit of Scottish legal history. Trial by jury has been used in criminal cases in Scotland for centuries, and yet it was not until 1815 that trial by jury was exported from England and transplanted into the Scottish culture. In Lord Campbell's biography of Lord Eldon, and Eldon was Lord Chancellor for 2.5 decades in the early part of the 19th century, and by the way, his monographs and manuscripts are now owned by the Georgetown Law Library, which is a wonderful prize for me. Lord Campbell described the parliamentary debate when Lord Eldon introduced a bill to establish trial by jury in Scotland in civil cases. And Campbell wrote the following: Lord Eldon insisted on at once introducing the English system and required that the jury should be unanimous, contrary, and get this, contrary not only to theoretical reasoning, but to the experience in Scotland of juries in criminal trials. It would be interesting to know what Campbell meant exactly by contrary to theoretical reasoning, but he did not elaborate. For criminal trials, the interesting pattern that had long been in place in Scotland and remains in place today was that of a majority vote in a jury of 15 members. So, and abstentions are not permitted, and so hung juries are not possible. We can have a conviction by a vote of 8-7. This is a bit of a surprise that this has been the custom for so long. Well, back to the introduction of the civil jury in Scotland, Member of Parliament Sir Samuel Romilly, in his meticulous parliamentary diary, wrote that when the Scottish jury bill was introduced, and I'll quote him now, many petitions had been received from different parts of Scotland objecting to the clause of the bill which required unanimity in verdicts and stating the repugnance of petitioners to, and Edward, I think you'll like this, the repugnance of petitioners to take the oath prescribed to jurors, which is that they shall decide according to the evidence, when the law afterwards compels them to decide according to the opinions of others. Romilly also wrote that respect for oaths cannot be too much encouraged, so these petitions should be listened to with indulgence and favor. But he then explained that in the committee, a clause was added to the bill that if the jury, after having been enclosed for 12 hours, should not agree in their verdict, the judge can discharge the jury and cause a fresh jury to be summoned. Romilly suggested an alternative. He said the juror's oath might be altered and might merely require the jurors to swear conscientiously to discharge their duty as jurymen, instead of swearing that they would give a true verdict according to the evidence. Or, alternatively still, a majority of the jury, as in criminal cases in Scotland, should give the verdict. Well, Lord Eldon and the man who would become the judge of the jury court in Scotland, William Adam, insisted that unanimity be preserved, but they included the rule that after 12 hours of deliberation, the jury could be dismissed and a new jury put in place. Now, a final comment about the juror's oath, picking up again on Lord Campbell's suggestion that the oath might be reframed. Edward suggests and asserts even that all dissenting jurors, by that I mean those who nevertheless join in a unanimous verdict, even though they dissent internally, that these persons violate their oaths as jurors, and he even says commit perjury by allowing their names to be attached to a verdict that they do not support. With this sweeping statement, I cannot agree. There's some room for disagreement, but the jurors take their oath before any testimony or evidence has been presented to them, and exactly how each juror conceives of the standard of proof that is applicable cannot be known. Also, as is extensively discussed in Clay Conrad's book on jury nullification, there's considerable vagueness and variety among the American states in exactly what the words of the juror's oath are. So I do not believe that Edward's insincere juror who capitulates in order to reach a unanimous verdict is a perjurer. I think I would even be willing to assert that in almost all such cases, the unanimous verdict meant that justice was done. And as a final footnote, I would simply mention that nothing has been said, as Edward noted himself, about this continuing debate on jury nullification in American history. And with that, I will close and once again say to Edward, thank you for your excellent revisitation of this subject and the question of unanimity, this analytically challenging question will continue. I should just mention finally in passing, and some of you probably know this, there's a lot of publicity about this case that's progressing in New York, the Pat's case, that was a case of a hung jury in a murder trial. And this was a New York Times headline last month. Retrial in Eaton Pat's case starts with a tough question. Who can sit on the jury? Thank you.
You're going to call him tonight?
You can call him. Go ahead.
I guess I'll come back up here, I guess. Avery, since you were sitting next to me. I
Yeah,
think first.
so I think, here's a question that I think is very much in Warren's spirit.
That was the worst presentation. Sorry.
No, he absolutely would disagree with the substance, but he would
Yeah.
disagree, he would agree with sort of the procedural sentiment. So I think that you need to think harder about what it means to vote sincerely and what it means to have consensus. Because I don't think it's the case that it is, that asking the question that Hans and her co-author asked, would you decide this if you were deciding all alone? That's not the right question. It could be totally compatible with sincerity and consensus for an individual juror to say, I have my thoughts, I've heard my fellow jurors' thoughts, they make good arguments, they feel much more strongly than I do, I defer to the consensus and join in it. Now, obviously, bullying doesn't fit. Bullying is not a good model. Wanting to get home for the baseball game is not a good model. But deferring out of respect after a deliberative, sincere discussion to the consensus, I think is completely, it could be completely sincere. I've sat on one faculty where things are done that way. I've sat on two faculties where things are not done that way. I suspect that Warren would not have been a big fan of subordinating his own view to the consensus of others after deliberative discussion, but I think that, especially given the political culture in this country as we're seeing this week, the assumption that sincerity in voting necessarily means sticking with one's principles no matter what, rather than paying some deference to the interests of one's fellow citizens and jurors, that deserves some thought.
So a couple of thoughts. First of all, you're absolutely right with respect to how the question was asked in the survey. It says if you were a jury of one, so there was clearly some effort to get the respondents to think about themselves, like not just as you're sitting here now having a cup of coffee after the trial, but thinking of yourself back in that jury room being the only one. But there isn't, for instance, a direct reference to the instructions of the judge or anything along those lines. So I think you're absolutely right that there can be people who thought, well, geez, I really would rather that this person had been convicted. But recognizing how the instructions work and talking to the other jurors about it, notwithstanding that, I can understand how we ended up at an acquittal. And so that's going to temper the nature of the results, although 56% is still a big number in terms of the absence of consensus.
But it may be that the reason the unanimity rule is tolerable is because we have this understanding that somebody who's in a small minority will be willing, under the proper circumstances, to defer.
Well, and so then the question is that a good thing? The jury instructions about, again, they vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. They don't ever say, and capitulate if you think that everybody else is being pretty reasonable, right? So, and so the result is that what we get out at the end in terms of a verdict is opaque, right? In a way that I think is probably not a good thing.
I would question the word capitulate.
Okay, well, all right, that's a strong version. Alan,
So I want to make an assumption. So the assumption I make is that people vote insincerely when they're in the minority and they just want to get the thing done. But if you give me that assumption, then I think you've got a majority rule right now.
well, so yeah, one of the things that we talk about in the early article is definitely the fact that it feels like that from a practical perspective, there really sort of is a 9-3 rule working, because that's the number where if the minority group is that size or smaller, there tends to be just, I don't want to say rolling over, but deference to the majority. But the problem then becomes that it's very arbitrary which juries revert to something like a 9-3 rule and which juries do not. And for defendants, that level of arbitrariness seems completely unfair, right? You might get a jury where somebody says, no, we've got unanimous rule here. Or you might get a jury where the members of the minority say, well, yeah, but look, we got 9 people over on that side. That's good enough for me. There's no guidance from the courts about when you're supposed to do one versus the other. And so that's, to me, problematic. I mean, we talk about the arbitrariness associated with who gets the death penalty versus who doesn't get the death penalty, right? And when that doesn't line up with anything concrete and relevant to the case, then that sends up red flags. So this issue about which juries decide to revert to 9-3 or 8-4 or whatever, and leaving it in the hands of the juries, do we want to defend that as the?
Well, but your suggestion is we just have 93 always.
Well, but
Have 93, that should be okay with you.
yeah, that gets us most of the way there, as it turns out.
It'd be happening now is the point.
Well,
Jurors.
What?
They're costing jurors for having gone along when their instructions were to be.
yeah, and it's one thing to say, okay, the rule is now 9-3. I mean, what they have in England, for instance, right, is that they have a rule whereby when the jury has deliberated up to a certain amount of time, then the judge goes in and says, okay, we'll now accept your verdict for, 10 out of 12 is what the rule is, which, by the way, has been that way for 50 years now in England, and they essentially got rid of peremptory challenges roughly 4 years later. So before you get all excited about the fact that, this would be crazy, in addition to the Scottish example, England has been using 10-2 with no peremptory challenges now for, half a century. Yeah.
So, looking at this, I'm wondering what you think the function of jury deliberation is, and how it changes ex post if ex ante jurors are told not, that they need to continue unanimous
Yeah.
decision, but a majority one. And I suppose a follow-up question is, if we're doing a comparative study, how would you know if England's changes improved things or made them worse?
Well, I mean, there have not been rioting in the streets, so far as I know, since the change. Experimentally, what we observe is that if you have a unanimity rule, deliberations go on longer, but functional deliberations do not appreciably go on longer. That is, you get to a point where it starts to be people separate into camps, and there's a lot of back and forth, but no new information exchange, and it's a question of who's going to give in kind of thing. So experimentally, we observe there is more participation, that is, more people talk under unanimity, although how much that contributes content-wise to deliberations. So there are costs to moving away from unanimity in that regard. On the other hand, the kind of negative behavior we worry about, the bullying, the name-calling, the silencing kind of stuff, that goes up dramatically with unanimity as opposed to a less demanding jury rule, because in order to get over that final hump, you basically have to browbeat these people into submission. So there is experimental evidence about how the deliberations will change. The other thing is, this is what I do for a living now. I go watch mock trials all the damn time, and I sort of watch how it happens, and typically what we'll do is go in and say, we would like you to reach a unanimous consensus, right? But they're deliberating for maybe 2 hours before we all got to send them home with their checks, right? And so often it's the case that we let them go for a little while, and then we walk in there and say, okay, we realize not everybody in the room agrees, but let's see whether we can get 10 out of 12 or something along those lines. The nature of the conversation under that doesn't, to my eye at least, change appreciably. Those are civil cases, though, almost entirely, so caveat there for sure. But it is something that does get studied. Lisa, family prerogative.
Last question, too. Okay. So Edward, do we know anything about whether in the situations where people reported themselves as having dissented from the verdicts, those cases might be the ones where the result was in some way a compromise. And so do we know what the impact would be of sort of not permitting holdouts, if you will, to essentially have the bargaining power to kind of induce the jury to convict on a lesser charge or something like that?
So, all right, so in the paper, the authors actually, their primary focus is on trying to learn something about people who hold out versus those people who conform. And so I had to actually back out of the article the summary statistics that I presented to you today. They have multiple measures of this conforming dissenter as a function of, for instance, whether it was simply a disagreement with the nature of the decision, that is conviction versus acquittal, versus, for instance, if you've got lesser included offenses. And so there is some stuff in there, but it's hard to kind of tease out sort of how much of this is a function of the fact that, you know, you ended up with a verdict of second degree. There were 3 people on the jury who wanted first degree and 3 people on the jury who wanted only manslaughter. Do all those people count as conforming dissenters? The numbers I gave you, those people don't count. That is, if you count those people, the summary statistics go up even higher. But I don't remember it going up a lot higher. And in the analysis that they do of the individual dissenters, I think they get rid of those people only because they're trying to get a sense of the people who were fundamentally dissatisfied with the result. That is, they didn't throw away the data, but when they were doing their statistical analysis, they couldn't have 7 categories to put people in, so they were trying to do the most stark comparison they could. But I imagine if you got their raw data, you could do somewhat more detailed analysis of that. So, all right. Thank you all very much.
Hello, everyone. When I think about Warren, I think most of his fun-loving spirit and enthusiasm for various carbohydrates and fried food. I also think about what was said by others. But one of my most vivid memories was from many years ago of a trip to Vienna because the European Association of Law and Economics, whatever its actual name is, had a meeting there, and Warren wished to visit some beer garden in the outskirts of Vienna. And all I can remember about that was getting on various subways and then trains, then finally arriving at this beer garden. And I actually don't drink beer, I drink only wine. But that didn't matter to Warren. He ordered beer for me. But I did like the Wiener Schnitzel. And I also think about all kinds of pastries and really good whipped cream, which we had at several places, one of which was called Demmel's. And it was a truly rich experience, is all I can say. Just one other comment. Kathy, where are you? Yeah. I loved your account of Warren's hostility toward behavioral economics, in part because I have the same view, but I don't usually express it. Okay, so now let me talk about my effort to write a paper that actually makes a recommendation to do away with the doctrine of law. What am I suggesting? I'm suggesting that a particular doctrine of tort law, which I'm going to disclose to you in a second, but it should be eliminated And this would be easy to implement because all you would have to do is eliminate it. There's no replacement that I'm suggesting. And the effect of this would be to expand the scope of strict liability, which of course holds that if you cause harm, you should have to pay for it, even if you were not at fault. In the background, I'm assuming the victim did not invite the harm. So an example would be, I'm driving a car, and a pedestrian, not through any fault of that person, turns out to be run over by me. And I wasn't at fault either. Let's say it wasn't speeding, there was no sense of negligence. Under strict liability, I would have to pay for harm. So now let me say what the evil doctrine is. So according to the restatement of torts, the most recent version of it, there are two requirements for imposing strict liability. Number one, your activity must be dangerous, assuming that you took due care. So there are many things that you do that are dangerous, even if you took reasonable care. I would actually say one of them is that if you are driving, taking reasonable care, you still present a danger to bicyclists who are going along the side of the road, because a car is a big, heavy object. It's moving at some speed, usually, and the poor bicyclist doesn't have any protection. So if you hit the bicyclist, it could be curtains for that person, or something bad could happen. So the second requirement, in addition to danger, is the one I can't stand. I've hated it for years, and now I've been moved to investigate how it came about, and also why is it that I really don't like it. So this requirement is that the activity in which you were engaged must have been unusual. So a classic example of an activity that the law looks upon as unusual, I'm not sure it really is unusual, but the law considers blasting to be unusual. I would think that owning a poisonous coral snake, it's native to Australia, as a pet would be an unusual activity. And according to the law, if I did own that kind of snake and it escaped its cage and bit somebody like Alan, yes, this is actually a compliment to Alan, because to be talked about is better than not to be talked about.
We have a theory about it.
Yes. So you would be strictly liable if you owned a poisonous snake as a pet. But if you're engaged in a common activity, like driving, you're not strictly liable. If you run over people, and those could be not only bicyclists, they could also be pedestrians. So that's the doctrine. And if it were eliminated, strict liability would be applied much more than it is. Right now, it's a pathetic doctrine because it's hardly ever applied. And if this requirement were eliminated, it would be applied quite broadly, because the way the requirement works is such that lots and lots of activities are considered to be common. For example, I have on this slide, operating a railroad, a railroad train might run over somebody, transmitting gas and electricity. If there's an explosion, typically this would be governed by the negligence rule, not by strict liability. So just a great number of areas of accident would be converted quite possibly into areas of strict liability rather than fault. So I'm not talking about something minor. And I actually think that many lives would be saved if we switched to strict liability. And I'll say why in a few minutes. So I want to talk about three things, and I'll try to be brief. And even if I don't try, I'm going to be stopped by Lee. How much time do I have left now, Lee?
About 3 minutes.
Let's see.
Roughly.
I don't have to take that.
That's fine. Okay. So the three issues are, how in the heck did this requirement come about? And I knew nothing about the answer to that question when I started this paper. And it was the most interesting thing to me, because it just seems dumb. Like, why would you consider dangerous activities and contemplate imposing strict liability on them, and then give a free pass to dangerous activities when a lot of people are engaging in them? It just seemed crazy. But when I read about how it emerged, I decided that given how the people who devised this requirement were thinking, it wasn't crazy at all. Given the proper historical perspective, I can well understand it. And then the second thing I want to discuss is, what is the functional or economic argument in favor of strict liability? And the third thing is, what's been said defending this requirement? And one thing I'm going to note when I get to that third part, I find very curious, which is that, first of all, there have been no articles written on this requirement. So there's not literature that's devoted to this requirement that I've found, but there's certainly remarks made about it. And within the law and economics community, there are 3 individuals who've commented on it, not at length, but to some degree. And those are Richard Posner, Mark Geisfeld, and Ken Abraham, all very thoughtful people who are very interested in torts. And they all defend this requirement. And I think their defenses are, to be friendly to them, not persuasive. And what I ask myself is, why are they moved to defend this requirement? And I think they just want to defend the common law. And I also observe this in my students. A lot of times they've only been at school for a year, and yet they will go to the mat defending the common law, and the restatement they regard as the Bible. It's really, I find it odd. Okay, that's my introduction. So now let me say something about how the requirement came about. I would really like to say a lot about it, but there isn't time. So basically, it was the requirement made its first appearance in the first restatement of torts, which was published in 1938. It was the product of over 10 years of deliberation by a bunch of advisors to the first restatement. And this group was headed by a gentleman named Francis Bolin, who I think I actually know, but he's been dead since about 1939. But I've read pretty much everything he's written. A person with a very acute intelligence and well respected at the time in the torts domain. Now, the restatement is supposed to be, in theory, a restatement of the law. But as my paper tries to demonstrates the wrong word, verify is a better word. This requirement you cannot find in previous decisions. I can't. And the reason for that is there are a lot of decisions in which common activities have been made subject to strict liability. For example, snow falling from a roof of a building onto somebody and injuring that person. A cesspool which leaked in some fashion and polluted the well of a neighbor. And there's cattle, livestock that trample a neighbor's crops. You know, owning livestock, I would say, is a quintessentially common activity. So there are many instances of common activities which were made subject to strict liability because they were dangerous. So it contradicts the absolute requirement of the restatement that if it's a common activity, it doesn't matter whether it's dangerous. It is not going to be subject to strict liability. Okay. I also looked at articles that were written before the publication of the restatement, and I looked at most of the treatises on torts from around 1865 to 1938. There's no discussion of anything resembling this. So my conclusion is Francis Bolin and his merry troop made it up. Okay. Why did they do that? What I'm going to say is a conjecture. And the conjecture is that, and by the way, I have to make a conjecture because I've looked at the minutes of all the meetings of the board of the advisors to the restatement from the beginning in the mid-1920s to the end of 1933. And by the way, the ALI has destroyed most of its records, but the Harvard Law Library, just by coincidence, happens to have copies of the minutes. Not all of the minutes. Well, they probably do, but they can't find some of them. Okay. But by 1933, the drafts of the crucial part of the restatement did include the uncommon activity requirement. So since I've looked at all the minutes up to when they included it, I conclude that they didn't discuss this when they had their meetings. I'm sure they did discuss it, maybe in correspondence, maybe over the phone, who knows what. But so far, I don't have a record of their deliberations. But I think there are two reasons why they adopted this. Number one, they thought that strict liability was a very strong form of liability that threatened business and everyday activities of people with just too much liability, just too heavy a form of liability to use. They want to be very cautious about its use. You see this in many decisions up to the 1930s. There are quotations in the footnotes of the draft. And so that was reason number one. Reason number two is that they all seem to think that fault was morally superior to strict liability, that you shouldn't, other things being equal, you should not impose liability on somebody who didn't do something wrong, where they equated wrong with negligent behavior. So those are the two reasons. So if those are your reasons, you don't want to roll out the heavy weapon because you don't want to threaten desirable business activity and personal activity, like driving, then it would make sense to 5 minutes left, okay, to do what they did because then they, by insulating common activities, they reduce the threat of strict liability to activities that might be valuable to people. Now, what I am moved by is the power of strict liability to create greater safety. That, if you thought about that, you would maybe do a double take and maybe not adopt this view. But they weren't thinking about deterrence or safety. I see almost no evidence of that being a concern. And I think because, well, not only did Calabrese, maybe he was born by then, but he hadn't started writing. It wasn't on their radar scope. And there are various comments to the effect that if you're not negligent, you're really not creating a risk. So the strict liability didn't really have very much to address in terms of boosting safety. I think that was their view. So I understand it. One or two more comments, and then I'll quickly conclude. The rest of the world, the civil law world, does not have any doctrine resembling our uncommon activity requirement. And England doesn't either. So I would say the United States is a total outlier in the world in having this doctrine. And by the way, most of the civil law world does impose strict liability on drivers if they hit pedestrians or bicyclists, and for many other common activities. So I certainly don't regard what's in the restatement as having a strong legal pedigree, put it that way. Okay, what about I'm going to dispense with my PowerPoints now. So what about the economic arguments? I'll just say what they are very quickly. You might want to ask, you might not want to ask. There are two reasons why I think strict liability can improve safety. The first is really simple, and that is that I think the negligence rule doesn't police all aspects of behavior that can affect risk just because of lack of evidence. And the older I get, the more I'm involved in cases as an expert, the more I think about practically real-world situations, the more I believe this is extremely important. Just give one example. You're driving. I think what's extremely important to risk is how frequently you look at your rear-view mirrors, whether you scan ahead for danger. I think that's of great importance. That will almost never come up in a negligence determination. It's not observable to the courts. What's observable is your speed, whether you move out of your lane or something like that. But a ton is left out, and I'll just leave it at that. The second reason, but under strict liability, since you're going to be paying for every accident, you'll pay attention a lot more than you would under the negligence rule, because then you'll only be worrying about what the court can see and adjudicate with respect to. The second reason is completely different, which is that if under strict liability, you will, since you're paying for everything, you might cut back on your level of activity to save yourself money. Whereas under the negligence rule, as long as you act with due care, you, by definition, don't have to pay. And therefore, you might not take into account the harm that you're causing on average. And this would be important when an activity is dangerous. Okay, so it's because of strict liabilities leading to greater safety that I think that any activity that is dangerous above some threshold should be subject to strict liability, just to cut down the number of accidents for these two reasons. And therefore, giving this get-out-of-jail-free card to all common activities is undesirable. Okay, what about the 1 minute left? Okay, I'll just give one thing that Posner and Geis, well, I'll just give one justification that they offer for the uncommon activity requirement. This justification is really, you have to listen to it to get it, I think. At least I have to say it to myself over and over again to understand it. They think that common activities are very valuable to people who engage in them. And therefore, if you impose strict liability on people engaging in common activities, I'll use the example of owning a poodle, a pet poodle, because people love their poodles, that if you impose strict liability for dog bites on a poodle owner, it just wouldn't do any good because people love their poodles. They're not going to give up their poodles. They're not going to stop walking their poodles. But they say if you engage in an uncommon activity, then it's probable you don't enjoy it that much. And therefore, if you impose strict liability on those people, like the coral snake owner, then those people will get rid of their coral snakes.
Thank God.
Yeah. Okay. My reaction is, what in the world are they talking about? If, it's true that most people wouldn't want to own snakes, and they don't own snakes. But there's some people who are fascinated by snakes, and they own them. And I don't know why a person who owns a coral snake as a pet wouldn't consider that as important as somebody who owns a poodle as a pet. So the whole hypothesis just seems off the wall to me. So I'll stop at this point and let Lee comment on this.
All right, see if I can figure out how to get to my slides here really quickly. There we go. All right, so I really enjoyed this paper. Before I get to talking about, I don't know, my criticisms of it, I guess I will mention 3 notable events that happened in 1987 that really important to this conference. A lot of things happened in 1987, but these were especially important. One is Steve Chevelle's book, Economic Analysis of Accident Laws, published. In that same year, Warren Schwartz assigned Chevelle's new book to his fall 1987 1L tort section at Georgetown University Law Center. Now, this was sort of a path-breaking thing to do, a little unconventional thing to do at this time. Law and economics wasn't such a big deal anywhere, especially at Georgetown, and to do this was kind of a big deal. But then, of course, the third thing that happened was that I was randomly assigned to his George class, which, of course, changed my life. And so I actually still have my copy of the book that I bought, and I was looking at it, and like every margin is like filled with notes and arguments and examples. And so in some ways, it's sort of this perfect thing to be able to be here commenting on Steve's paper all these years later, after having that early engagement and having had sort of the engagement in the class with Warren kind of bringing his critical eye to the things that you had written in the book, and being able to continue that conversation. Okay, so the world of accident law is split up into 2 parts, negligence and strict liability, 2 domains. And this picture here is not to scale, because actually strict liability, as Steve mentioned, is very, very limited in its scope, the domains that it applies to. And what Steve does in his paper is he doesn't really contend that we should get rid of there being a distinction between these 2 realms, but he quibbles about kind of where the line should be, and argues for an expansion of strict liability by removing the requirement of something being uncommon. So my critiques come in the form of 2 alternative titles I'd like to suggest to Steve for his paper instead of the one that he actually has. The first one is, I really think this is where you're going with it. And at the end, you kind of say some things like this. Why strict liability should apply to all activities, right? So we just do that, right? And we get these advantages, and I'll talk more about why I think that the dangerousness requirement doesn't really do anything important. Economically speaking, then there's not really a reason to keep that requirement. But if we are going to keep a separate domain, I would say that really the better of these 2 requirements to hang on to is the uncommon requirement and get rid of dangerousness. That there's more to be said for the uncommon requirement than has yet been said in the commentary that exists, and so I want to suggest at least a few hypotheses for why it might be rehabilitated, and also kind of why I think the dangerousness thing is not really a coherent place to draw the line. Okay, so here we go. Why dangerousness is not a helpful line. So first of all, I don't think that strict liability's advantages and disadvantages depend on whether an activity is dangerous when due care is exercised. The 2 points that Steve just mentioned that make strict liability work better than negligence have to do with unpoliced or poorly policed dimensions of care that are not observable to a court, and then also activity levels, like those are elastic and you can change how much you do the activity. So those things seem to be applicable regardless. They don't really seem to track onto dangerousness. The disadvantages of strict liability, which Steve talks about in the paper, very well known, is that with respect to victims, right, victims kind of have the mirror image situation if we are just applying some kind of contributory negligence defense. The court won't be able to observe everything they could have done. So strict liability can sometimes be a problem if victim behavior is large. But again, there's no reason to think that the sort of role of victim caretaking tracks on to dangerousness in particular. But there's a broader problem that I tried to kind of get at in these last 2 bullet points, which is that dangerousness has the same kinds of information problems that infect the ability of the court to apply a negligence standard more generally, which is that if it can't observe the things that make something really dangerous, then it may not be able to identify what's dangerous. If it's able to identify dangerousness without respect to those unobservables, then it's not clear that there's going to be a reason to expect there to be a lot of efficient risk reduction possibilities. So to maybe make this more graphically, if we have kind of a danger scale, going up here on the y-axis here, we have risk if due care as policed by courts were taken is at one level, but then we have a lower level of risk, right? The ability to lower the risk if all efficient precautions are taken, including choosing optimal activity levels. The concern that Steve focuses on in the paper is, this gap, right? That's the range for efficient caretaking. You don't want to eliminate risky activities or dangerous activities. You just want the optimal level, and it's that gap between what could be policed through a negligence standard and what would occur if somebody was really bearing all the costs themselves. Okay, so we might be pretty low on the danger scale and still have a pretty big gap. And some of the examples that Steve gives, I think, are like this. Like, he gives an example of a grumpy dog. This is not a poodle, sadly, but he gives the example of a grumpy dog that if it's not fed, like the owner happens to know that if you don't feed the dog and then you walk it, it'll be really grumpy and it'll bite people. And so the precaution, which might not be observable to a court, that you need to do this, you need to feed the dog before you walk it or it'll bite someone. So this is not, it's unclear that a court would classify this dog walking as a dangerous activity. But it might become dangerous because of something unobservable. Okay. Also, if we move up the danger scale, it's not clear that that gap gets bigger necessarily between what courts can observe. We don't want people to be, there's no sort of efficient risk reduction below that second bar. What we care about is the gap. So that's why I'm not sure that the dangerousness really helps. Okay, so on to kind of rehabilitating the common, uncommon line. Here's a few ideas I thought of, and some of these are empirically untested, but at least some possibilities for why it might have more going for it than Steve suggests. First of all, there's fewer, there are at least arguably fewer unpoliced or poorly policed elements of due care for activities that are really common. The hypothesis here would be we kind of know what this activity is. We know the ways to take care. There may be repeat play, custom, widespread expertise. There may be the ability to regulate outside of the tort system and have things that count as negligence per se if you violate them. With respect to traffic, for example, we have a lot of regulations in addition to tort liability. They can't capture everything, but there might be an intuition that there's less that's left unpoliced by anyone. But the second one is sort of more of a political economy kind of story. If an activity is really common, it affects a lot of people, then we might expect there to be reforms or interventions either coming from within tort law or emanating from somewhere outside of tort law that then address the safety problems that might be produced by a pure negligence regime. Okay, and so in Steve's paper he mentions there are sometimes legislative carve-outs where things that don't meet the uncommon requirements still get strict liability. We know from looking at the evolution of products liability that brings in strict liability in a way that was not originally there, even though you're doing something pretty common, manufacturing products. Nuisance law, another area where something like strict liability applies in that it's not a defense that you're doing your activity as carefully as you could. There's lots of ways that regulations and other things can come in as well. So maybe the real reason is just sort of a political story. There's these politically mediated ways to get at conduct that are not all within tort law, and that having something be common increases the chances that we'll be able to get at it properly. A couple other things quickly. One is that we might think that insurance markets develop better around common activities. If that were so, then we might have an additional source of potential regulation there. The activity level, say, of driving, right? I mean, insurance companies try to figure out how many miles how much people are driving, at least roughly meter that. There might also be, with common activities, like what I'm calling here habitual lumpy efforts. Like if you're driving to try to keep from hurting yourself, you might also happen to end up incidentally be driving in a way that is not so dangerous to pedestrians. You may not be able to put your driving your pedestrian's hat on and drive carelessly and then go out and be in your driving where I might get crushed by a truck hat. And then finally, the very, very last thing I want to mention is that the commonness of an activity may track onto its value, not the point that he was making about the value of the person, but the value of having that activity be prevalent in an area where it might conflict with some victim activities, okay? Because we're worried about activity levels on both sides. And so an example of this is a case, I think Steve actually cited the Indiana Harbor Belt case that involved the Blue Island rail yard where there were a lot of toxic chemical spills. And Judge Posner wrote an opinion in which he suggests, well, this doesn't really seem like it should be strict liability. It's no more realistic to propose to reroute the shipment of all hazardous materials around Chicago than it is to propose relocating the homes, right? Maybe the homes are in the wrong place. It says, brutal though it may seem to say it, the inappropriate use to which land is being put in the Blue Island yard and neighborhood may be not transporting hazardous chemicals, but residential living. It's just like building your home between the runways at O'Hare. So when we start to think about choices of where to do activities, the prevalence of an activity could potentially play a role. All right, since I have no one to time keep me, I have to make myself stop now, but thank you all.
Thanks, Lee. I want a copy of your PowerPoints afterwards. Just a very quick reaction is, I think the dangerousness requirement makes sense in the following respect. This doesn't really contradict what you say. That when there's danger, then there's work to do to eliminate the danger because there's a problem. And so I'm not saying strict liability will reduce the danger, but at least there's work for it to do. There's something for it to do. If you take an activity that doesn't really present much danger at all, like walking, yes, a really clumsy person, I guess, could bump into somebody else, and if that person was carrying a Ming vase, it would be expensive, or you could bump into somebody, and they could fall into the road and then be run over by a car. But basically, walking's pretty safe. So I'm not worried about the negligence rule governing walking. But wherever there's a significant danger, I think cars present such a danger to people and bicyclists, then I think because strict liability has the potential of reducing risk, it should do it. So just a very simple thought, not original. On your comments about why common activities might actually make sense to exclude from the domain of strict liability, I had two feelings. One is, here you are, just like the rest of the people, defending the common law. Doesn't it move you that the whole rest of the world has never even thought about this? They have nothing like it. Furthermore, think about activities like hunting. Possibly it's dangerous. We govern hunting by the negligence rule. The rest of the world makes hunters strictly liable when they shoot hikers or each other, which appeals to the common sense of most people. And that's why they make drivers strictly liable, and the list goes on and on and on. So my feeling about these defenses is that they're just so stories. And they're also, I think, in a literal sense, a little bit confused, because they tend to suggest that there's a correlation at work that often makes common activities less dangerous because they invite regulation, for example. But that's fine. That may be true. I think it is true. But what the uncommon activity requirement does, the real work it does in the law, is it says that if a common activity happens to be dangerous, despite all the regulation and despite all the due care, if it happens to be dangerous, like hunting is and like driving is to pedestrians and people, then it should not be exposed to strict liability. And that's a purely American requirement. It did not grow organically out of legal decisions. It was made up by Francis Boland. And by the way, he was a very temperamental person, and he quit the committee in a fit of pique before it actually published the restatement. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Okay, Alan.
So, first of all, when the first restatement was, that was when America was great.
No, Alan. It was in the 1950s.
Again.
It was not, okay.
So that's my main comment. My other comment is if you have strict liability, some people will optimize. And then it said that, well, a correctly set or an optimal negligence standard will, at least as to care, give you the same result. So I think the real contribution, in a way, of this paper is to say that you can't correctly set the negligence standard because of the things you say that are often left out. And if you started with that, then this would be a minor part of a different article in which you would give a whole lot of examples of why you can't correctly set the negligence standard, and therefore a whole lot of doctrines would be called into question, including this one. So my suggestion or question is, it seems to me that in this paper, the tail is wagging the dog a little bit. The real point is you can't do negligence according to you. If you can't do negligence, then a lot of things follow from that, including this.
So a quick response is there couldn't be a point less original than this one. I mean, for example, Holmes, who is often described as an enemy of strict liability, wasn't, and the argument he gave, it was just in a sentence, but he didn't go on and on. He wasn't that kind of person. He said that the courts are incapable, this isn't a direct quote, but the courts are incapable of certain niceties of judgment under the negligence rule. And for that reason, strict liability has an attraction because it places the incentive, I didn't use the word incentive, but something equivalent to it, on the actor who can best control risk. So almost as if he was, a pre-Calabresian. So I think that what is in this paper about the problem with the negligence rule is a much more elaborated and forceful expression of the weakness of the negligence rule. If there's a contribution, it's because of the examples, which I think I need to amplify. But I am now, somebody spoke about born-again economist. I believe in a way I never did before, that the negligence rule's problems are not minor, they're major in many important domains. Warren 2.0.
Just from an empirical perspective, in watching jurors deliberate about negligence in torts cases, there is this oddly perverse result, which is that the more uncommon is the activity, the more likely jurors are to essentially impose a strict liability rule on the purveyor of that activity, The idea is essentially that if you're going to go out and experiment, if you will, then you assume the risk, which is odd, right? Because from a foreseeability perspective, right, it all goes kind of the other direction. But that's generally what we observe. The weirder and the wackier the circumstances, the more likely jurors are to just sort of, regardless of what the controlling rule actually is, essentially impose strict liability on the person.
Well, I mean, that's not surprising, and I think if you're doing something quite different, it invites the response that maybe you were negligent for having engaged in the activity. Like if I saw somebody going to work on a pogo stick, and then that person collided with me, I think my emotional reaction would be, what the heck are they doing going to work on a pogo stick? Let's make them strictly liable for bouncing their way to work.
How about a skateboard?
Well, yeah. Al?
Two things. First, a little historical footnote. I think that the uncommon use idea comes from Lord Cairns' opinion in Rylands versus Fletcher, the non-natural use of land. So I don't think it's totally made up by Boland. But the more important comment I have is, as you say it, strict liability is for harms that your activity causes. And it seems to me that there's a situation, there are a lot of cases in which what we mean by causation is very, very difficult to separate from what we mean by fault. So if you take your example of the drivers and the bicyclist, did the activity of driving cause the collision, or did the activity of bicycling? Well, Coase would say both. It takes two to tango. The way we answer it in practice is to say, who screwed up, right? And so my suggestion is that in a lot of cases like that, the change that you're advocating will make very little difference in practice, because in the situations where we would say that the driver caused the accident, almost always we would be saying that the driver is the guy who screwed up. And that results in the same outcome liability-wise as the negligence rule.
Okay, so two quick responses. I don't think I agree with you about your comment about the non-natural use. And it's not that that language didn't suggest this requirement, because I think it did. But there was a great debate on the interpretation in England of the meaning of non-natural usage. And it centered on, I would say, not the commonness of an activity, but on how dangerous the activity was. And I cite the two best-known English decisions, one called Rickards versus Lothian, and the other called Cambridge Water. And Rickards concerned a bathroom that was leaking, and it's often cited as something that's consistent with uncommon usage. But because the court said operating a bathroom is a common activity, and it said that there should be no liability for the fact the bathroom leaked. But if you look at the circumstances of the case, the bathroom was not dangerous at all. In fact, the reason that the bathroom leaked is some unknown person broke into the bathroom at night and plugged up the drains and turned on the water. It was a malicious act. The bathroom wasn't dangerous. So this decision is neither here nor there as to whether a dangerous common activity should be subject to strict liability. Yet the language of the holding, if you just look at the language of the holding, you can pretend that it justifies the uncommon activity requirement. Cambridge Waterworks directly contradicts the uncommon activity requirement, because in that decision, Lord Gough, or whatever his name was, I think it was Gough, said that if the tannery, which he said it was a common activity in a village near Cambridge, had known about the risk, that the risk it was creating was large. If it had understood the nature of the risk, he thought it didn't, but if it had, he said there's no way that despite the commonness of the activity, that he would have refrained from imposing strict liability on the tannery. So it was a direct contradiction in the most important English case of the uncommon activity restriction. So this is why I say in England, even though it seems like there were precursors to the requirement, not really true. And when I read in the American literature that the English decisions justified our requirement, I find every single such argument to be sloppy, not really looking at what happened in the English decisions. So on the two-sided aspect of activity level choice, that victims can choose their activities, as can injurers, of course I agree that that is true, and this is why there isn't an a priori argument in favor of strict liability. But I think that, in fact, bicyclists and pedestrians already have a non-liability related reason to take a lot of care not to expose themselves to cars, because they're going to be, who cares whether they can collect damages? They're going to be dead or something like that. So I think they've already made decisions, and most people don't expose themselves to much risk, whereas I think drivers, if strictly liable, and also I've left out commercial vehicles, which are very important, I think there would be fewer accidents, significantly fewer accidents. I can't prove it because there's almost no data. But I am certainly moved by the fact that the rest of the world does use strict liability in that area.
I think we are out of
Yeah,
time,
okay.
unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
So let's-
Okay, I think we should get started, just so that the lunch hour is actually our law and economics workshop, so we actually have to be on time by then, or my students will not know what to do. All right. So Andy and Jennifer are next. Take it away. Okay.
So I'm Andrew Dougherty, and Jennifer Rankinen's right there. And we only knew Warren for something like the last 10 years, I guess, of his life. But that was, it was always a very positive relationship. It was like Alan talked about, an academic setting, often at the NDER meetings, but also at the LEA meetings. And it was a great interaction. He had us here for part of a towards conference. That was quite a jump on his part in a sense, because we're the non-lawyers in this room. He was always, we found he was always very supportive of the sorts of things that we were trying to do, even if it was sometimes, some discussants had said, a bit overly mathematical, so we'll only have a little bit of
Squidgies.
what?
He called them squidgies. Squidgies. That's what he called equations. They were squidgies.
We very much appreciate Warren's interest and his comments, which the question of, is this an interesting thing to do, would come up, and we'd have to respond about it, and he would push us, and that was good. So I just want to say that we very much appreciate being invited. We want to thank Lee, and Josh, and Steve, and others who put this together, because it was, Warren and we used to sometimes sit together at the ER meetings and pass rude comments back and forth, and that was a nice experience. So we wanted to talk about, this is some work we're doing now, that as far as we know, this was not an area that Warren worked on. Issues of really criminal procedure, I think, is the right way to think about it. Though from our viewpoint, there's a bit more of an economics context. But I have no doubt in my mind that if Warren was here, he'd have his hand up a couple of times through the discussion and make some interesting comments, somewhat acerbic, I agree, but also very useful, and that we'd come and say, okay, let's think about what we're going to do with that. So let me just say that this is sort of our motivating story in the paper. It's a case involving a man named John Thompson, who was on death row for 14 years of 18 years in a Louisiana prison. And 4 weeks before his execution, a private investigator that his counsel had hired found exonerating evidence, exculpatory evidence that was in fact suppressed by the district attorney's office, the New Orleans district attorney's office, at the time of trial. This was a violation of what I'm sure everybody knows here very well as the Brady Rule, which is that should have been provided to the defense. So we got interested in the question that sort of suggests, and it suggests actually more than just the incentives for prosecutors to reveal. It says something about what happens when you form teams of people to work on something. So Thompson then was able to sue the New Orleans office, and the jury awarded $14 million, $1 million for each of the 14 years he was on death row. The Supreme Court, a 5-4 decision with Thomas writing the majority opinion, vacated that award, and Ginsburg's this dissent, which is quite informative, is worth reading. But as she makes clear, and has been also reemphasized in a Georgetown Law Journal article by Alex Kaczynski, there's a lot of issues having to do with Brady violations around the U.S. and a number of federal and state cases that have gone on, and this is becoming a question of important policy about the fact that these are very rarely penalized, even though judges might note them, they're very rarely penalized. And of course, since prosecutors are immune to civil penalties, the particular penalty here was something that the New Orleans office was going to have to pay. We see this as part of a larger question that has to do with information release and how teams may retard information release. Teams have a lot of advantages in many circumstances, and we see examples of this in the Merck, in the situation with Merck and drug information, and some of us are quite familiar with the recent Volkswagen suppression of information about pollution. So that's the direction our work is going over the next few years, is in this area of questions of teams and information. So here's the overview of the paper. Prosecutors are we've done some previous work having to do with prosecutors and career objectives and stuff like that. Prosecutors have career concerns, a desire to win a case, and they also have moral concerns, a disutility for suppressing evidence that leads to convicting innocent defendants. In this model, we'll have prosecutors who weigh those two things differently, and they privately weigh those. So it isn't known which way they shape this. Their level of disutility, there is their private information, and the disutility is suffered by them only if their action on their part, they know that it caused a false conviction. So there's a judge we're going to have in here who takes together all the possible procedural ways for pursuing prosecutors for such misconduct. May investigate, he chooses whether he's going to investigate the prosecutor if the convicted defendant has come across later some exculpatory evidence and submits it. And her cost of investigation is her private information, and this is really essentially something having to do with the value of pursuing this versus the costs of actually engaging in this investigation and the spin-off effects of that. And she derives utility from identifying prosecutors who suppress these evidence. The judges cannot commit to such an investigation policy. They wait until they see a situation, and then they take a look and say, should I investigate this or not? So here's our base model. We're going to have initially a prosecutor who may possess this exculpatory evidence, And if so, he chooses whether to disclose it or not to the defendant. And the model is set up in such a way that if that's not disclosed, then the defendant for sure gets convicted. So the prosecutor knows not disclosing it leads to conviction, disclosing it would lead to acquittal. If P doesn't disclose, B is convicted. B may later discover the evidence, they may not. It's also possible that the prosecutor never came across the evidence to begin with, and the defendant later finds some. So that sort of uncertainty is what plagues the judge's decision. In that case, the defendant is exonerated, and the judge decides whether to investigate the prosecutor for Brady violation, and we have the idea in here that there's some cost associated with finding that prosecutor having engaged in misconduct. So that's the penalization. The main part of the paper that we're interested in fact, springs from this model and says, what happens when we have teams of prosecutors? And teams of prosecutors exist for perfectly good reason. One reason is there's a lot of work, and that gets shared. Another reason is it's a form of training by which new prosecutors end up being trained by older prosecutors. We'll have two types of configurations we'll talk about. 21 will be a shorthand for there are two prosecutors, but only one of them randomly gets the information. That's exactly, there's an example like that in the Thompson story. On the other hand, it's possible that they share that information one way or another. And we're going to consider endogenous information configuration, and we also want to talk about sort of office culture. That is, that the prosecutorial office may enhance the incentive to suppress information. So one of the findings that I'm going to pretty much skip over some of the intermediate stuff because I'm getting signaled that we're getting close to halfway through the discussion. More suppression of evidence in the two prosecutor one informed than in the sole prosecutor story. Taking out all the advantages of teams, that teams themselves lead to more suppression. There's less suppression in the 2-2 configuration compared to the 2-1 case. But then one of the interesting aspects is that when the choice by the team, effectively whether they're going to share the information, be a 2-2 configuration or a 2-1, the 2-2 configuration is not an equilibrium, meaning that we expect to see with teams a lot more suppression than would occur in the sole case. So there's an aspect of team construction which enhances the suppression of information. We provide some comparative statics results, what happens when the sentence goes up, or the likelihood of an investigation being effective, or the various things like that. What happens is they change. So these are really testable sorts of measures. And we find that both this any coordination mechanism to try to deal with the fact that we may have a prosecutor who is quite willing to pursue and suppress information, but another member of the team has a greater disutility than the first one, that the two of those together may end up with information being released more frequently under two people than under one. So there's a trade-off here about the size of essentially a cartel controlling information that may mean that defendants could be better off with larger teams because there are more people involved in the game. So I'm going to skip over this and say that this is the basic story. Along this axis over here, we look at the question about how strong is the disutility of the prosecutor for convicting an innocent person, and the higher they're out along here, the higher we are over here, the greater their disutility. So when they're trading it off versus the value of the win, these guys are more likely to reveal the information. Over here is the probability that the judge is going to investigate should the defendant who was convicted come up with the exculpatory information. That would then trigger this investigation. And what this picture means is that there's a sort of an equilibrium between these two where people who have very low disutility of convicting will end up, that's in this range down here, they'll end up suppressing information, and potentially they're going to get investigated, but they're trading off the low probability that they'll get investigated versus the gain to their career. So that's the basic story. As we add prosecutors, that this range of willingness to suppress increases, and at the same time, because it's costly to investigate larger teams from the viewpoint of the investigatory side, that actually shields that effect within the team, which is why, since they're less likely to be investigated, they're more likely to engage in the behavior. Let me pass this over to Jennifer, who's going to talk about the endogenous information thing, so that we can dance off of here to be able to get to lunch on time.
How do I go back?
How do you go back?
Back. Okay. I just want to briefly talk about this case. This is the 2-2 case. This is a situation where when the exculpatory information comes into the office, it's automatically seen by both members of the team. And this has the feature that now you only get suppression if they both want to suppress it. So if you think about in the 2-1 case or the 1-1 case, there's a draw from this distribution of disutility, and it either meets the cutoff to suppress or doesn't. In this case, suppression only occurs if both of their draws are below the threshold. And so, in principle, when the judge later sees this evidence provided, but it wasn't reported before, they kind of have a lower belief that it was bad behavior because both of them would have had to, have low disutilities of convicting somebody. So in some sense, this sounds like the way you want things to be structured, right? So that they would both have to suppress in order for suppression to be effective. But then we look at an endogenous structure of the information within the office, and there are a couple ways you can think about it. You could think about it as it's ex ante, the structure is chosen, and the judge knows what it is. Okay, that's the observable today. But you could also think about it as being chosen ex ante, but the judge can't tell whether people share information within the office or not. Alternatively, you could think about it being chosen at the interim stage. That is, I'm on the team, I get some information, and now I decide whether to share it with my colleague or not. And what we show is that under ex ante choice, the prosecutors always prefer to organize as a 2-1 team. That is, one of them gets the information. It's not automatically shared. That's better than just having one prosecutor, so there's a value to being in a team. But also, sharing information, the 2-2 case, is not in equilibrium when the information structure is endogenous. Okay? So that kind of says that even though you would like the 2-2 case to be the way things are configured, you shouldn't expect that to arise as part of a Nash equilibrium. We also go back to the 2-1 case, where one prosecutor receives the information randomly, to think about informal rewards or sanctions within the office. So there might be positive benefits to disclosing. You might get praise from inside the office when you disclose, or you might get negative informal sanctions when you disclose. And so those have the predicted effects, right? If you get additional informal rewards for disclosure, then you'll get more disclosure in equilibrium. And if you have negative feedback when you disclose, then you'll get more suppression. But we also think that a more subtle version would be that suppose that P1 receives this evidence and discloses it to the defendant. The other member of the team can evaluate, well, what would I have done in that situation? And we might think they only impose an informal sanction on their colleague for disclosing if, in the same situation, the prosecutor that didn't receive the information would have suppressed it. Okay? So in that case, there's an informal sanction that's imposed. So this introduces some non-convexities, non-monotonicities in things, because now when I get the information, I'm trying to figure out whether my colleague is going to want to have suppressed it. I might want to disclose it, but if they might have suppressed it, then I'll face this informal sanction. So there's a complementarity to it. The higher their willingness to suppress, the higher my willingness to suppress. And that can cause this kind of nonlinearity in the best response for the prosecutors And so there may be multiple equilibria here, but we can say that all of them involve more evidence suppression and more investigation as compared to the case with no informal sanctions. So we think about, in the end, what are policies that might reduce suppression? You didn't see them, but there's a large number of parameters here that reflect all kinds of things, like the likelihood that, well, in fact, you'll see what they are as we go through this. The prosecutor gets a benefit S from a conviction, so that's reflecting the career concerns and payoffs to having won a successful conviction. It's not totally clear how you might reduce this, but a higher value of this is going to cause more suppression as people pursue these career goals. Partly because it's not subject to control, right? It's like, what's the chance that I'm going to get it after I leave the prosecutor's office, I can get elected or something to public office. But some of the other things are more subject to manipulation. So there's a penalty K for a prosecutor who has been verified to have suppressed evidence. And as Andy said, these are extremely low at the moment. I think this Kozinski paper talks about only 2 prosecutors ever being sanctioned, having criminal sanctions for this, one being the guy for the Duke lacrosse case, and there was another guy who spent, like, I don't know, 2 days in jail or something like that. Anyway, they're very, not very much suppressed. But in California, there's a new law that's authorizing prison time of 16 to 36 months for prosecutors that suppress evidence. And that's based on another thing that we'll talk about later on an episode that's going on in Orange County in California. So other sanctions could include a suspension or loss of your law license or demotion or firing. Those are also rarely employed. And Kozinski in his article suggests that judges should employ a naming and shaming strategy, that there's no reason why they shouldn't identify people in their court who have been doing this. They find it, they decide it's been going on, but they don't really do anything about it. Another thing we could do is increase the disutility of prosecutors for causing an innocent deed to be convicted. So presumably that distribution is affected by law school ethics courses, continuing education, and the office culture in the DA's office. Increasing the likelihood of P discovering exculpatory evidence or the defendant later discovering it also will reduce the extent of suppression and equilibrium. So more resources for investigation, more use of technology, things like that might affect that. And finally, there's the question of the judge's return. What is motivating judges to do these investigations? They have to have some perceived value to catching violators. So what are some things that might affect that? Well, Jay may have a moral concern for justice as well. The judge may view punishing evidence suppression as investment in future better behavior. But if prosecutors can retaliate, then judges may be less likely. They may see less return. And this is, again, there's this situation going on in Orange County where a judge has disqualified the DA's office from prosecuting murder cases, and in return, the DA's office has gotten the judge recused from a whole bunch of cases. So that could go either way. And then there could be broader reorganizations. You could have outside investigations. You could have other judges that are not in this interrelationship that's continuing with these prosecutors' offices, or you could have an agency that does investigations. You could remove prosecutorial discretion about material and exculpatory and just say that all evidence has to be shared with the defense, because right now they can make a judgment that something's not exculpatory, but it's not really material. And so, Kozinski has an argument for just open files, and apparently there's a law in North Carolina that requires this now. So that's it. We're ready for questions. You want to come up for questions?
When we get,
Yeah. See if we can make it come up.
So this is a typical Andy and Jennifer paper. It's elegantly modeled, it's clearly written, it's beautifully worked out, and it's about something important. So I really would like to sit down, but I'm told I have 5 minutes, so I've got to do something. Also, I'm a little bit concerned that although I'll do my best, that my comment may be a bit out of sync, because I only had the paper, and Andy and Jennifer focused on the team aspect. But the paper begins and lays down and spends a lot of time with the one prosecutor model, and that's essentially a basis for the team concept. So I'm going to say a few things about the one prosecutor model as my comment, and basically sketch out briefly what it is, and then talk about some concerns I have, which essentially go to the relation among the variables and really are more questions than comments. So starting with number 2, the main part of the paper model is a game between the court and at first the prosecutor. The prosecutor realizes an apparently subjective reward for obtaining a conviction, that's S, but he incurs this utility T from convicting an innocent defendant, and T varies with the particular prosecutor. The court imposes a penalty K if it finds that the prosecutor suppressed evidence, but a key feature here is that the court only learns that the prosecutor suppresses evidence if the defendant independently discovers it and reports it. So what triggers the court's investigation is the defendant showing up with exculpatory evidence. The court incurs some costs to investigate, which is C, which varies with the judge, but all judges get some apparently subjective benefit, V, which is if the court discovers that the prosecutor suppressed. So essentially in the one prosecutor model, which then carries over, the prosecutor trades off the disutility of convicting an innocent defendant, which is indexed by the prosecutor's type T, and the possibility of being penalized if she suppresses against the benefit S from a conviction, however it is procured. And equilibrium in the model is a cutoff rule. Above the cutoff level, the good prosecutor reports exculpatory evidence. Below it, she will suppress. And the court's type here, as I said, is its cost indexed by C, so the lower the is C, the more likely the court is to investigate. And there's also in equilibrium a cutoff rule for the judge, below which, if the costs are low, she will investigate, above which she won't. Now, in the paper, which I advise you really to look at because it's beautifully done, the paper elegantly derives these cutoff rules as best responses to the strategies the other party will follow, and it sticks in probabilities and a bunch of other really neat and essential things. Finally, or not so finally, given Andy and Jennifer's presentation, the paper lets there be more than one prosecutor and considers teams. And the paper closes, and this you've seen, with some innovative and interesting normative suggestions for reducing evidence suppression, which is kind of a big deal. So what are my concerns? Well, one thing, as Andy and Jennifer said, it's widely believed that prosecutors suppress. It's also widely believed that prosecutors are not punished when they are found to have suppressed. And the state of evidence raises 2 suggestions. One of them is the paper shows beautifully precisely how a penalty influences the prosecutor, that is, on what variables does the act on the prosecutor. So the paper essentially makes a strong normative point. I think the normative point might be pushed a little bit more. Also, the lack of data may reflect the lack of well-grounded theoretical analyses. And so the paper's propositions, which is situated beautifully in the economic analysis, may be reframed a little bit to suggest empirical inquiries, because this really ought to be studied. Andy and Jennifer have done the theory for this context, and that might help later econometricians to do things. So now I have to, since I'm a discussant and it's Warren Schwartz's conference, I have to try and say a few things that are a little bit concerning, but it's not that I really believe them, but I'm playing a role here. So the prosecutor's, I'm going to begin with the prosecutor's disutility T, which characterizes particular prosecutors, that is, some are better guys than others, but the reward from a conviction, which is S, seems exogenously imposed. But S, it seems, should vary with the prosecutor's type. So for ambitious prosecutors who want to be mayors, S is large, because for them T is small. Ambition makes them bad guys. And so if I want to generalize, a high T prosecutor gets positive utility only from convicting the guilty. A low T gets positive utility from convicting anyone, so that the sanction S should be a function of T, and maybe in the model you can de-emphasize S and really put more weight on the T variable, because that seems to be doing the work. In the model also, exculpatory evidence E is exogenous, and it's one thing. So if E exists and becomes public, the defendant is acquitted, and otherwise not, but evidence can vary in persuasiveness. So if you denote evidence in a case as E, drawn from a distribution where E weak to E small, and the probability of acquittal is increasing in E, it would then seem that whether a particular prosecutor will disclose evidence would be a function of both E and T. That is, a prosecutor with a high T, a really good guy, may disclose any evidence that would help a defendant, while a prosecutor with a low T, that is to say maybe a high S, would disclose only really strong evidence. And what this suggests, among other things, is that a one-size-fits-all penalty, K, which is in the paper, is not optimal. Now, the paper suggests raising K for this problem, but in the model, it doesn't individuate K to the prosecutor's behavior, and that may be a more realistic thing to do. Also, exculpatory evidence in the model has, as I said, it has an independent existence. It's out there, somebody finds it or doesn't find it, but it seems that the prosecutor can affect the probability that the defendant will discover evidence. So that is, in the paper, suppressing is not reporting, but suppressing might also be essentially hiding, concealing, doing whatever, and it may be that for realism that should be taken into account. So finally, I wanted just to talk about the court, which gets some exogenous reward, V, for discovering a prosecutor who has suppressed evidence, but it would seem that V should be varying with the difficulty of discovery and also varying with the prosecutor's conduct. So a very bad prosecutor, maybe the court gets more utility out of catching that guy than a different kind of prosecutor. And finally, as we say, that D just happens, D is not modeled, that is, the defendant is not modeled. So the defendant just either discovers evidence or doesn't discover evidence, but what D discovers may be partly a function of the type of evidence, the type of defendant, and also the type of prosecutor. So you more things might be said about the defendant. So I want to summarize basically the main part of my comment, which is that in the models, some of the variables vary, and therefore they index type, like T and for the prosecutor and C for the court. But other variables, E, the evidence, S, the prosecutor's utility from convicting, the judge's value, V, and the penalty don't vary. But it may be that some of these variables are functions of other of these variables. So maybe a little bit more should be endogenous, and then there would be a question how the results would change. I think they would change qualitatively, but I think the basic work would go through. But the paper might be a little more realistic if some of these variables were endogenized. Now, the last couple of things I want to say, and here I just ask people, what do I know about this field? But first of all, it seems that courts don't investigate prosecutors because they lack the institutional resources. So if anyone investigates, it's my impression that it's the local bar association which imposes sanctions. Now, at the end of the paper, Andy and Jennifer suggest involving some external body in this area to investigate and punish prosecutors, but that might be foregrounded a little bit more. That might be put in, because that would add some realism. Also, I think there should be a little more evidence about how prosecutors' offices actually work. Now, as I say, on the little I know, that two prosecutors in the same office play a simultaneous move game is a little bit unrealistic. Usually you have a single prosecutor who's assigned a case, or maybe a lead prosecutor with a team. So I think a little more evidence about fitting the prosecutor's office to the model might be helpful. And finally, I just want to say something about the team analysis, which Andy and Jennifer presented. I hope you could see just how lovely it is, and in the paper it's even more nicely done. But I think there are other possible applications I would suggest, and since I do a lot of corporate work, one of the things that really calls itself to my mind is a multi-division firm where each division wants to shift resources to itself, so each division wants to suppress evidence that might suggest it might be optimal to shift resources to some other division, and I think that would be a really nice, natural application for what they have here, because there are some papers that talk about divisions who behave in this way. There's a term for it called influence costs, but it's never been formally modeled, and certainly not as elegantly modeled as Andy and Jennifer have done. So I think this is a really, really good paper. I just think it could be made a little bit more realistic, but I think it's really a neat, important thing.
Up here for questions? Sure.
So just to keep the Warren train going, I'll suggest another option for endogenizing. So I think you have the preferences are randomly drawn from a distribution. But Scott Baker has this really neat paper about who selects into being police. And the idea is that when salaries are very low, you get selection based on power dominance. And so his idea is, you know, we raise salary and you get a different type choosing to come in to do that job. Maybe we should raise the salary for a president of the United States. I'm not sure at this point.
How that would affect things.
So I would guess that the, you know, the optimality of the rule might change if you think that it impacts the people who are drawn into the job. And they come in with preferences over putting bad guys away regardless of whether they're guilty.
Yeah, we have an obscure discussion in there having to do with shifting the distribution over the disutility of convicting people, and that would be a place where that would fit in, because that's certainly the idea that the system might evolve drawing in people. In the Thompson case, it's a very good example, I think, of sort of a movie Training Day, where Denzel Washington takes Ethan Hawke out for a ride to try to convert him into a corrupt cop. And if you look in this particular case, it's the young guy who was just added to the prosecutorial staff, direct out of law school, who Ginsburg's opinion makes clear he was the one who was involved in a particular type of suppression, hiding, literally checking out the evidence for a while and making it unavailable and then checking it in right at the beginning. But why did he know that this would be a good thing to do? The New Orleans prosecutorial office has a long reputation of having played close to the edge on this, including the fact that Harry Connick, who was the chief prosecutor, had himself been found to have engaged in Brady violations earlier in his career, but seemingly in the majority opinion didn't seem to know about the details of the Brady rule. So I agree with you that who gets selected in and how this sort of, what we think of as an inside reputation, separate from the outside reputation that the judge might be aware of, that is who has engaged in this behavior before. How that inside reputation as to who to play with is an interesting question, and that's part of that evolutionary issue.
I just want to make one comment on Alan's remarks, and that is that, so we have the judges all get the same V, but have their costs drawn from a distribution, and the prosecutors all get the same S, but have their disutilities drawn from a distribution. Given the way those two things enter their respective payoff functions, we could have a random draw, which is the V per unit of C, okay, or the S per unit of T. So there's certain ways we could make those both variable and still keep it reflected in one draw. It may not be the way you would want it, right? It may be that you want some other kind of correlation between these, but at least at first cut, we could let some of
Could
those
incorporate
things
that
vary.
So you talk about individual penalties for prosecutors, and I just wonder, what about institutional or team penalties, and how would that, mostly because of how would that affect then the judge's decision of how to assign responsibilities within.
Right, so we have assumed that you can only be penalized if it is in fact verified that you did engage in suppression. I'm really interested to see Abe and Shmuel's paper, because they're going to
With the
address
group,
exactly
right.
that question. When you can penalize the team without actually identifying for
Well,
sure that somebody did something.
That's literally what's gone on in this Orange County case, is that 250 prosecutors have been blocked from being involved in certain types of cases. So that is that.
Yeah.
We have that, when it's two prosecutors who are informed, it's costly to assert this, but each of them can be penalized are penalized at the same rate. The public good here is that they all, when they get a conviction, they all benefit from what's called S, that is the sentence length. The bigger the sentence length, the bigger their benefit, and they all benefit from that. But should they be found to have, in fact, engaged in misconduct, then they lose that.
But it only the people
Actually-
that actually engaged in misconduct suffer the penalty.
Right. So there is a penalty per prosecutor. It's not just one prosecutor, but
Right, I guess I'm thinking about sort of like then the team organization might internalize those costs, and then they can
Right.
better monitor,
Right.
like their own errors.
right.
Quick question, yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's, reasonable to have sort of the no commitment case on the part of the judge, but it seems like there are some simple potential commitment devices, right, which would reflect some version of potentially a negligence rule. Right? So if we thought that some cases it made sense, the 2-2 configuration was beneficial enough, right, would it ever make sense to have, say, look, when the judge will never investigate, right? You can probably commit not to investigate if the office had a 2-2 configuration, or, maybe something even a little bit more minor, right? So there'll be a lower penalty if there's a 2-2 configuration, right? Is that sort of thing ever gonna be optimal to induce that configuration?
I'm not sure, and I'm not sure how you know whether they have a 2-2 configuration, right?
Well,
Because,
I mean, you said one of the things you considered in the model was where this configuration was observable.
right, but we don't think that's a very reasonable
Okay.
assumption. We just went through all the possibilities.
Into endogenizing it and then
Right.
saying that, well, in
Right.
the endogenous case, 2-2 is not the equilibrium.
Yeah,
So, but some sort of commitment like that to a rule, I mean, any of these rules, commitment to those sorts of rules means that you're likely to suppress provision of information about the violation itself. We know that from the literature having to do with vicarious liability, that the firm now turns around and colludes with the bad.
okay. Thank you.
Okay, so it's great to be here to honor Warren. I met Warren, late in his career, thanks to Andy suggesting that we work together. But Warren and I ended up writing 3 papers together, and he was a wonderful and very insightful co-author. One quick story to share: we were out at Stanford giving a talk on our second paper. And they had us at a hotel that was about a mile from the law school, and on the walk over, it turned out to be very fortunate that Warren walked about a mile an hour at the time. So it took us about an hour to walk from the hotel to the law school, and in that time we developed the idea for our third paper. There was a huge benefit from that. I'll always remember that very slow but very productive. So this is a joint work with Shmuel Leshem on orchestrated cheating, group versus individual punishments. I had thought, following Andy and Jennifer, that it wouldn't be so bad to have a more technical presentation, but unfortunately they weren't as technical as I hoped to be. So now I'll be the first one to have equations here. Squiggles, right. All right, so our motivation for this paper was the Russian doping scandal in the Olympics, right? As probably you know, the World Anti-Doping Agency recommended a complete ban on Russian athletes in the Rio Olympics. All right, there was a report documenting Russian anti-doping agencies covering up urine samples both before and after the Sochi Games. They systematically eliminated and substituted positive urine samples in all sports. This seemed to be orchestrated and run by the Russian government. And that's why the World Anti-Doping Agency recommended this complete ban. The IOC didn't follow the WADA's recommendation. What they ended up doing was banning 118 athletes, but allowing 271 to compete. Basically, what they did was sort of flip the burden of proof, right? They said, well, if you can show that you haven't engaged in doping, then you can compete, but otherwise, you can't. Right? So our motivating question from an article we saw on 538 is from this quote: what we don't have is evidence that every single Russian athlete took part. Is it fair to punish a whole nation of athletes? When is it okay to potentially deprive clean athletes of a chance to compete in order to punish those associates who cheated? So we thought, being economists, this was a good motivating question as long as we substituted the word efficient for fair. So that's our question. Right? So literature, there's some other papers on group punishment, but they mostly focus on sort of other scenarios and other rationales. Things like information forcing, within group deterrence, and the like. So I won't spend too much time on them. The way the model is set up, So again, trying to capture the Russian situation, right? We've got N players, we can think of these as the athletes in the game, and one leader. This is the Russian Federation or Russian Sports Federation. And so these players all have a very simple decision, right? So each athlete chooses, are they going to cheat or are they not going to cheat? They've got a private cost of cheating, which we assume is uniformly distributed between 0 and 1. This we think of mostly as a moral cost, right? So it's kind of like Andy and Jennifer's tea, right? How guilty do they feel when they win by cheating? And that's going to vary across athletes, right? And the model cheating means that you win for sure, and that has a value that we normalize to 1. Not cheating means you win with some lower probability, pi, and in our analytical sort of 2 and 3 player models, we just take pi to be 0 for simplicity. When we do the n player simulation, we allow for other values of pi. The leader's choice is to orchestrate cheating or not. Right? What orchestrating cheating means is just lowering the detection probability, right? So there's some original detection probability p, and if the leader decides to orchestrate cheating, that can be reduced down to q. We assume, at least for now, that there's no cost to the leader of orchestrating cheating. And then the third player here, sort of in the background, is an enforcer, and the enforcer is going to choose a group punishment threshold, right? So what that means is if there's n players, they choose some threshold m, somewhere between 1 and n, and if m players are detected cheating, then all n get punished, right? So that's what we mean by group punishment, right? There's enough cheating among Russian athletes that all of them get banned. Right? If m equals n, then that's equivalent to individual punishment. You're only punished if you are detected. Right? Again, we assume sanctions here are fixed, right? And the enforcer also can't change the detection probability, right? So this is, what do we do when sanctions and detection probabilities aren't high enough to generate complete deterrence on their own? Right? The payoff, so for the players, first we have some probability of group punishment. This is going to be endogenous in the model. We call that PG. It's a function of the threshold. And if you cheat, right, then the players pay off. They get the 1 for victory. They have this moral cost, and then they get a sanction. They get a sanction if they're detected cheating, right? Even if there's no group punishment, if you get caught, then you get sanctioned. If they don't cheat, then they still might get sanctioned if enough others are cheated, and so that happens with probability PG of m, and if we had orchestrated cheating, we just substitute the q in place of the p. Right? If you don't cheat, then you get this lower payoff for victory, less likely to win, right? And you also might get sanctioned if there's group punishment. And so we develop you get a simple cutoff for cheating, that this function delta, and if your cheating cost is below that level, then you cheat, and if it's above, then you don't. For the leader, so the leader's payoffs, what we do is we just say what the leader cares about is the combined payoffs of all the players except for this cheating cost. So the leader has no moral cost herself, and she also doesn't care about the players' moral cost, right? She does care about how much they win, and she also cares about their sanctions, right? If you think of the sanctions as being you can't compete in future games, that impacts the leaders as well, right? So the leaders' payoffs given by this expression here, right? The first one is the combined sort of expected payoffs from the success of the players on the leader's team, and then we subtract out the sanctions, both when fewer than m are detected, right, then we get the individual punishments, and when more are detected, then everyone gets punished, and so the leader suffers the sanction that's imposed on everyone. Right, and again, we just put q in place of p if the leader has chosen to orchestrate cheating. All right. So first of all, I'll talk about the 2-player analysis and then give you a sense of what goes on in our n-player simulation. Right? So the 2-player analysis, again, we set pi equal to 0. And so we're going to get a cutoff for individual punishments. That's exactly the normal situation, right? Your payoff for cheating minus your expected sanction. Right? So everyone whose cheating cost is below CI will cheat. People above it will not cheat. Right? Under group punishment, it's slightly more complicated. Right now, your cheating cutoff is going to depend on your expectation about what other people are going to do. right? So you'll cheat if your own cheating cost is less than this expression on the right, which looks like the one above, except that now we have to discount the penalty because you might get penalized even if you don't cheat, if the other player cheats and gets caught. Right? And so we get a different and lower or higher cheating cutoff under group punishment, right? So this is the basic standard effect from if you're innocent convictions reducing deterrence, right? If you're likely to be found and punished anyway, then you're more likely to cheat, right? Other thing that's interesting about this is notice in contrast to the individual cutoff, right? The effect of increasing the probability of detection here is ambiguous. There are times when increasing the probability of detection can actually increase the cutoff because you figure, if it's so likely people are going to be detected and someone's going to cheat anyway, right? Then, it's very likely because of that high probability of detection, I'm going to be punished and I might as well cheat, right? The leader then makes a decision under individual punishment, right? The leader's payoff can be thought of actually as just the square of this cutoff, and the reason for that is, right, if CI is the probability on a per player basis that somebody cheats, and CI is also the leader's payoff from somebody cheating. And under group punishment, it's similar, but we have to sort of subtract off this baseline effect of the probability of punishment, even if somebody doesn't cheat, right? So CG squared is the probability of cheating times the excess cheating payoff, right, over no cheating, and then minus CG times PS is the expected group punishment, sort of irrespective of whether a particular player cheats, right? So what we find is, first, sort of the simple case, if CG is decreasing in P, so that's the sort of expected situation where we get less cheating if there's a higher probability of detection, then if this expression CG minus PS is positive, the leader will always want to orchestrate cheating. They'll always do better if the probability of detection goes down, but if this expression is negative, it's possible that the leader doesn't want to orchestrate cheating, right? The basic rationale here is, right, there's a negative externality from the player's perspective. Right? When they cheat, that reduces the playoff of the other players. The leader internalizes that externality. And so there are situations where the leader wants a higher probability of detection in order to induce the players to cheat less. And if that effect is strong enough, right, we can actually get less cheating under group punishment, despite this increased individual incentive to cheat, right? So that's what that says, right? So here's the picture. There's a little numerical messiness here, but the orange region, right, are situations where group punishments reduce cheating, right, and the blue regions are where group punishments increase cheating. The bottom region we think is not, it's theoretically interesting, but not as practical, because that's actually a region where what's going on is this is where the leader actually doesn't want to orchestrate cheating because they want a higher probability of detection in order to induce more cheating, because the players aren't cheating enough from the leader's perspective, because the leader doesn't have these same moral concerns, right? We figure there's other ways the leader can make people cheat. So, it's theoretically interesting, but not practically interesting. The upper region here is the region where the leader will, under group punishment, right? So for the two-player case, that's where one person gets caught, both players get punished, right? That's the region where the group punishment causes the leader not to orchestrate cheating, and as a result, that sort of that increase in detection probability, because the leader isn't orchestrating cheating, outweighs the increased individual incentive to cheat under group punishment. And the reason the region is restricted here is throughout we're restricting our sanctions to be less than 1 over P, so that we're sort of assuming we're in the region where there can't be complete deterrence with individual punishment. All right, so now let's talk briefly about what we do in our n-player simulation. Lee, how much time do I have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So first, just talk a little bit about the technique here. So what we're going to use here is we're going to use the normal approximation to the binomial, right, which means that the probability that m other people are detected if you don't cheat, if n is large enough relative to the probability of detection, is going to be normally distributed with this mean where n times p delta p is sort of the expected number of other people who are going to cheat, and the variance, sort of the typical variance for the binomial, right? And so we're going to use that then to numerically find the solution to this equilibrium probability of group punishment, right? So there's going to be group punishment, which is this PG of m, if it turns out that more than m players are detected, and that's distributed according to the normal CDF based on that. And this is something that, because the normal distribution is messy, right, we can't find an analytic solution to this, so we have to use numerical methods. Just use the find root command in Mathematica. And so what we do is we're drawing values of p. We're drawing values of the minimum q. Right? So this is a little bit different than in the two-player case. What we do is we draw a value of t, which is the most effective the leader can be at reducing the probability of detection, right? So if t is 1/2, the leader could potentially reduce the probability of detection down to half of the original level, right? But the leader doesn't have to. We assume if they can reduce it down to a half, if they decide it's optimal to reduce it only down to 80%, right, that's something that they can do too. And as we'll see, we sort of find that optimum also through these numerical methods. And we draw values of the sanction S and pi, this probability of winning if you don't cheat. For reasons that may have been a mistake, we always chose n to be 100. We wanted it to be large enough that this normal approximation would, be valid under most cases. But there are other reasons why maybe that was a mistake. But that's what we did. We examine all that so for each draw, right, what we have to do is we have to see how much cheating do we get with every possible threshold of group punishment. So we have to run this and examine each of these m's. We thought that m equals 5, 5% would be a reasonable lower bound. Actually, it turns out that a lot of our values are at that, so we probably should have considered smaller m. And then we do it not quite always up to 100, but up to a high enough level that effectively that's equivalent to group punishment, right? You can imagine if the probability of detection is, 20% and not everyone's cheating, right? If you had a threshold of, 80%, right? Effectively, that would be like individual punishment because you're never actually going to detect 80% of, out of 100 people cheating. And since these things take a long time, we were trying to conserve how many different thresholds we had to think about, right? So for each of these draws, we find the equilibrium probability of group punishment. Sometimes there's multiple equilibrium, and when that's the case, we assume the leader can coordinate on the preferred, her preferred equilibrium, right? And we do that for all m and for every possible reduced detection probability in this range that we draw randomly, right? So then we find the individual cheating probability for each of these m, and we then select the one that has the lowest cheating probability, assuming the enforcer's goal, which is our social welfare measure here too, right, is to reduce cheating to its lowest level, right? So that gives us, we did this 5,500 times, for 8 times for reasons that we thought was too small amount to worry about, so we didn't really think about it too much. It didn't work, so we threw out those 8. But we have a data set here of 5492 parameter draws with the optimal m star. And what we try to do then is try and figure out how do these parameters correlate with that optimal threshold, right? So technically we transformed this to be between m star between 0 and 1, and right, we ran, this was Josh's good suggestion, we ran a fractional logit on this. Unfortunately, over 95% of the results had the situation where no group punishment is optimal, which effectively means that our results are mostly just testing group punishment versus no group punishment, particularly because when group punishment was optimal, it was always at the small range, right? So there's actually not that much variation between different levels of optimal group punishment, and the much bigger variation is between when we have it and when we don't. So unfortunately, that's what the results do. We hope to try to run these again with different parameter draws, so we get a lot more group punishment being optimal, and that should allow us to shed more light on that. So this is what the results look like. I'll just give you a brief interpretation. Group punishment is more likely to be optimal if sanctions are larger. The probability of detection without leader-orchestrated cheating, this P, is larger, as long as the sanction is high enough that there's some possibility of group punishment, and the probability of success without cheating is larger. In other words, in this region, like you saw in the picture, where we can't quite get complete deterrence, but we're pretty close to it, that's the situation where we really want to stop the leader from orchestrating cheating, getting us a lot farther from close to complete deterrence, right? The thing that's a little bit surprising is we also have group punishment more likely to be optimal when the leader has less ability to reduce detection probability. And the rationale for this is, although we'd really like to deter leader cheating in that case, it's very hard to do, because if they can reduce it a lot, right, then they don't really have to worry about group punishment being imposed. I'm about out of time, right, so brief conclusion. We examined group punishment with leader-orchestrated cheating. The main trade-offs: it increases individual incentives to cheat. It has ambiguous effects on the leader. It can either increase or decrease their incentives to orchestrate cheating, but it's possible for group punishment to reduce overall cheating if it stops leader-orchestrated cheating, and if this effect outweighs the increased individual incentives to cheat. And as I said, it tends to make the most sense when sanctions are slightly smaller than what's necessary for complete deterrence, and the leader can reduce that probability by the detection probability some, but not too much.
I'm not going to use any slides. My comments aren't technical, so I felt no need to do it. It's a very nice paper. This topic is very interesting, and the modeling is very clear. The results are complicated, but the authors really do a nice job of explaining them. And the key result to me, which is sort of the inverse of this, right, is that in some cases, group punishment can actually encourage orchestrated cheating. I mean, that's interesting. So I want to start, though, with comments about the motivation, about leader sanctions, about the probability of detection and sanction, and then about the simulation. So on the motivation, the paper's motivation is the Russian doping scandal from the 2016 Summer Olympics. And the problem of orchestrated group cheating clearly extends to other sports settings. And I'm a sports fan, so I find that interesting. But I think Shmuel and Abe need to provide other relevant examples of orchestrated group cheating to better motivate the paper and convince the reader this is about more than doping in sports. So they give two examples in the paper. That they mention briefly two examples: students cheating on a test and firms cheating on an international agreement. Those are examples of group cheating, but not necessarily orchestrated group cheating, right? So really, what are more examples of orchestrated group cheating? I don't know. Organized crime, do you punish all members of a gang when only some members commit a particular crime? Sort of corporate fraud, accounting fraud, some in the executive suite are behind accounting fraud. Do you punish the entire executive suite and the board of directors? And now we just got a new one today, right? Prosecutorial misconduct within an office. But I think making it more than about doping in sports, even though I think that's infinitely interesting. So then, now on the topic of leader sanctions, so Shmuel and Abe, they abstract from moral and economic cost for the leader associated with orchestrated cheating, and I think that's fine. But they also abstract from the possibility of any separate direct sanction on the leader. They assume the only sanction imposed on the leader is indirectly through the sanctions imposed on the players. Why? It seems like that's a policy lever that exists, and that, without having worked it out, could be effective and avoid this sort of deterrence trade-off associated with group versus individual punishment choice. Then on the probability of detection and sanction, they treat both of those things as fixed, and then you rule out the case where they're both high enough so that, players are never going to cheat. And so what you leave is the only policy lever left is this threshold M, oh, wrong slide, the threshold M of group punishment. I think that's all fine. I just would like a little more motivation for that assumption, because normally we think P and S are also policy levers where it's costly to raise the probability of detection, not costly to raise the sanction. And so in order to motivate looking only at these cases where you can't deter all individual cheating, you need to motivate why there's a constraint on S. And I think you can, and one of the papers you cited very briefly, the Michelli and Sergerson paper, they talk about there's a cost to false positives, and maybe that's why you don't want to just raise the sanction through the roof, because you're really worried about false positives. And then lastly, on the simulation, you solving this n-player model numerically, very nice use of a fractional response model. But just one question about the simulation. So you allow the dependence of S, the sanction, on P, the probability of detection, through the upper bound on the support of S, right? And this is to make sure that you're in your interesting case where S is less than 1 over P. And that rules out the case where players never cheat, but it seems that the dependence would be more deterministic, and it comes back to my comment about policy levers, right? If S and P are policy levers and it's costless to raise S, then S should be a sort of more of a deterministic function of P. Building it into as a part of the upper bound of the support, I don't think that's exactly the same thing. I have to think about that more, but it seems to me the dependence, that if you're thinking about them as potential policy levers, the dependence of S on P is going to be some more direct way than just the upper bound on the support of the draw of S. So another reason why I think you should motivate the assumption that there's some ceiling on S, that you're limiting your analysis to the case. But I go back that, this is really a wonderful paper, and I hadn't really thought much about this topic, and the modeling was just very clear. Helped me really think a lot nicely about this paper. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.